Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world half dream, half reality. A shimmering place where water meets earth and entire fields float like rafts upon a lake. You hover at the edge of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, blinking against sunlight that dances on canals wider than streets, with gardens stretching out in perfect rows. It looks like Venice, if Venice had corn taller than you and chili peppers dangling like red lanterns. You smell damp earth, wood smoke, and roasted maize drifting on the breeze. It's beautiful, but let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this city of floating plots. Between the biting insects, the watchful priests, and the awkward fact that human sacrifice was sometimes the ticket to keeping the gods happy, your modern sneakers wouldn't get you far. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to see this little community scatter itself across the map and across the clock. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glide along the causeway toward Tenochtitlan, the Aztec jewel set squarely in Lake Texcoco. Canals crisscross the city, lined with stuccoed buildings rising high, their steps leading up to markets, palaces, and temples. Paddlers push slim canoes heavy with cargo, bundles of herbs, baskets of maize, and brilliant orange marigolds bound for ceremonies. The lake reflects the snow-capped peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, volcanoes looming like painted backdrops. It feels unreal, as if the city is more dream than stone. But your stomach grumbles at the sight of roasted squash seeds, and you realize it's a very edible dream. A mainstream historical fact. Tenochtitlan, founded in 1325, was home to perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Imagine the logistics, feeding all those mouths without tractors, fertilizers, or Amazon Fresh. Instead, the Aztecs built a system both ingenious and picturesque. Chinampas, floating gardens that transformed the shallow lake into a patchwork of farmland. The first time you see them, your brain stutters. Rectangular plots appear to float, fringed by neat rows of willow trees, each one mirrored in still waters. Farmers balance across narrow paths, shoulders loaded with baskets of beans and chilies. Women in embroidered cotton skirts rinse herbs in the canals, while children chase each other along reed-woven walkways. Every sound is softened by the slap of paddles and the rustle of corn leaves. Historians still argue whether these chinampas were entirely floating in the way the word suggests. Some say they were more like artificial islands anchored firmly with stakes and layers of mud dredged from the lake. Either way, the illusion is there. You see fields rising from water as if the earth has decided to cheat gravity. And honestly, it works. You want to roll onto one and nap among squash vines. A quirky tidbit slips in as you watch. Chinampa farmers sometimes coated their faces in crocodile dung as sunscreen. No, I'm not making that up. Apparently, it worked as a natural paste to block the sun's rays. Although let's agree you probably wouldn't put that on your Sephora shopping list. Picture yourself dozing under the midday heat, thinking you're slathered in luxury when you're actually covered in reptile leftovers. Welcome to Aztec skincare. Your canoe glides deeper, and you sense rhythm in this landscape, rows and plots repeating like the beats of a drum. Here, maize stalks tower, their golden tassels shaking in the breeze. There, beans spiral upward, clinging to the maize like clingy little siblings. Fat squashes lie low, guarding the soil from the sun. This trio, the three sisters, feed nearly everyone, whether emperor or farmer, priest or child. You realize you've stepped into a city that is not only built on water, but also entirely powered by vegetables. Forget Teslas, maize is the engine here. As the sun lowers, pink light streaks across the canals. You pass a shrine tucked among gardens. Smoke curls upward from copal incense. A farmer kneels, offering a pinch of maize dough to the waters, whispering words you can't catch. You do catch the intent, gratitude, plea bargain. The gods must be kept on side, or the gardens wither, and with them, the city's beating heart. By the time darkness settles, torches flicker on the water, guiding late-returning canoes. Frogs croak in chorus, and somewhere, a flute drifts across the night. You lie back in your boat, rocked gently by ripples. It's not hard to see why Tenochtitlan was called the Venice of the New World. Yet unlike Venice, these waterways carry fields themselves, not just boats. Here, you don't just live beside the lake, you eat from it. Sleep tugs at your eyes, but curiosity keeps you alert. This is only the beginning. The first morning mist curls off the canals, and you blink yourself awake to the sight of farmers already at work. The sun hasn't fully crested the mountains, yet men, women, and children are out on the water, their canoes stacked with reeds, mud, and stakes. You watch them paddle toward the open lake, then return with loads of materials that will become something extraordinary. Chinampas, those floating gardens that blur the line between engineering and magic. From your low perch in the canoe, you can see it unfolding in real time. A farmer marks a neat rectangle in the shallow waters, about as wide as a tennis court. Stakes of willow or ahijote trees are driven into the lakebed, standing like sentinels. Between them, he weaves mats of reeds that shimmer golden in the dawn light. Canoe after canoe arrives, their passengers dumping thick, fertile lake mud onto the mats until the raft begins to sink slightly, heavy but stable. Soon, the mud forms a dark, earthy surface, spongy underfoot, yet firm enough to walk on. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Chinampas could yield 7 harvests a year. That's right, 7. In a world without chemical fertilizer, without tractors, these Aztec farmers created hyperproductive farmland on water. It's not just gardening, it's a living factory of food. You lean forward as a boy scatters maize kernels into the freshly laid soil, his hands moving quickly, confidently. His father follows, planting willow saplings at the corners, their roots sinking into mud and water. In time, these trees will hold the chinampa in place, preventing it from drifting like an unmoored raft. The process is so smooth it feels like choreography. You half expect them to break into song, but instead, there's just the splash of paddles and the soft calls of herons overhead. And here comes a quirky tidbit. To speed up fertility, farmers sometimes hauled in lake-bottom sludge, so nutrient-rich it practically steamed in the morning air. Imagine mud with the nutritional punch of a kale smoothie, only smellier. You glance down into the canal, where the water looks deceptively calm, but beneath lies a treasure trove of silt, fish bones, and decaying plant matter. It's the ultimate compost heap, gift-wrapped by nature. Historians still argue whether the very first chinampas were born out of necessity or as an intentional agricultural revolution. Were they simply desperate farmers expanding their land by pushing into the lake's shallows? Or were they master planners from the start, envisioning this checkerboard of plots and canals? Either way, the result is a landscape so unique that even centuries later, you can't quite believe your eyes. You hop down from the canoe, testing the spongy surface. Your feet sink slightly, like stepping on a firm mattress. Around you, others are already at work. Women with wide, woven hats kneel to plant beans beside the maize, their bracelets jingling softly with each movement. A girl no older than 8 drops squash seeds at their feet, then pats the soil with a rhythm that feels almost ceremonial. This isn't just farming, it's family life written into the mud. Your gaze catches on one farmer who pauses, leaning on his paddle, sweat glistening on his brow. He looks over his chinampa with pride, as if seeing not just crops but his own lineage stretching forward. This garden isn't merely food, it's inheritance, tribute, and survival. Without it, Tenochtitlan's population would wither. With it, the city thrives, feasts, and grows powerful enough to build towering pyramids and host festivals that shake the ground. A canoe passes by, loaded with willow cuttings, and the paddler gives you a nod. You nod back, feeling momentarily like part of the workforce. But your hands are soft, your shoulders untested by hours of dredging mud. One paddle stroke and you're already wobbling, while the 10-year-old behind you handles his canoe like a pro. The joke is clear. you're the intern nobody asked for. Still, the system fascinates you. You notice how the canals aren't just pathways for boats, but irrigation lines. Water seeps into the chinampas' edges, keeping soil moist even in dry seasons. It's passive irrigation, centuries before drip systems. The more you look, the more ingenious it seems, nature and human effort braided together, like those reed mats that started it all. As the day warms, dragonflies skim the water's surface, and the smell of wet earth mixes with the faint sweetness of blooming flowers planted at the edges. Farmers often grew flowers along with food crops, bright marigolds, delicate dahlias, because beauty mattered here too, not just calories. The sight of blossoms swaying beside maize feels like an unspoken truth. Even survival has room for color. A whistle pierces the air. Workers gather for a quick meal. From a basket comes tamales wrapped in maize husks, their steam curling into the sky. Someone offers you one, and you bite into soft, warm masa filled with beans and chilies. It's simple but nourishing, and suddenly you understand how these people endure 12-hour days on the water. The food is fuel, but it's also comfort. You lean back, chewing slowly, and your eyes drift across the vast expanse of chinampas. From above, it must look like a quilt, rectangles of green stitched together by silver canals. A heron glides overhead, casting its shadow across the water. The world feels steady, balanced, as though the gods themselves have endorsed this blend of human ingenuity and natural abundance. But as the meal ends and workers return to their tasks, you can't help but wonder, how long did it take to perfect this? How many generations labored, experimented, and prayed before the system was reliable enough to sustain a metropolis? That's the thing. When you stand here, ankle-deep in rich chinampa soil, you feel both the fragility and resilience of it all. One bad flood, one invasion, one pest swarm, and the balance could tip. Yet for now, under this morning sun, the floating gardens thrive, as they have for centuries. The midday sun hangs heavy above the lake, and you squint as you follow another canoe slipping between rows of chinampas. The air hums with insects, the water sparkles, and the farmers move with practiced rhythm. Today, you watch not the planting of seeds, but the careful craft of building these floating gardens. It's less like farming, and more like sculpting the earth itself, coaxing soil and water into harmony. Your guide, a man with weathered hands and a mischievous grin, leans on his paddle and gestures toward an unfinished chinampa. You hop onto its edge, your feet sinking slightly, and now you see every detail of its construction. First, the willow stakes, driven deep into the lakebed, form a rectangular fence. Then reeds and branches are woven through, creating a base. And finally, the thick, black sludge of the lake is piled on in layer after layer, until the rectangle rises above the waterline like a soggy cake left too long in the oven. A mainstream historical fact floats up here. The chinampa system added thousands of acres of farmland to Lake Texcoco, enough to feed Tenochtitlan's hundreds of thousands of residents. Without this innovation, the Aztec capital might never have grown into one of the world's greatest cities. The floating gardens were, quite literally, the foundation of empire. As you watch, workers wade into the shallows, scooping muck with baskets and pouring it onto the new platform. Their bodies glisten with sweat, their hair tied back, their movements steady. It's not glamorous, but there's a kind of poetry in the teamwork. Each layer of mud adds not only soil but also nutrients, since the lake bottom is rich with decomposing plants and fish remains. You wrinkle your nose. The smell is halfway between rotten eggs and swamp stew. But this muck is pure gold in terms of fertility. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that farmers occasionally mixed human waste into these soil layers. Yes, you heard that right. Night soil was too valuable to waste, so into the chinampas it went. You glance down at your sandals, and suddenly feel glad you didn't step too deep into that mud earlier. Aztec recycling wasn't just eco-friendly, it was downright unavoidable. Historians still argue whether the system was completely sustainable in the long term. Some claim the chinampas replenished themselves endlessly with dredged silt, while others believe overuse eventually degraded soil quality. Standing here, watching workers carefully dredge, you sense that balance was always fragile. Too little dredging, and the soil weakens. Too much, and the lake's ecosystem tips. The Aztecs were playing a centuries-long game of Jenga with nature. A boy runs past carrying willow saplings, their roots wrapped in damp cloth. His older sister follows, planting them at the chinampas' corners, where their roots will anchor into the water and their branches eventually provide shade. You run your hand along the young bark. It's cool, smooth, alive with possibility. These trees aren't just anchors. They're also windbreaks and living fences. You imagine, years from now, their branches arching over the canals like green cathedrals. Your guide laughs and offers you a basket of mud. You hesitate, city hands, soft palms, but you crouch anyway, scoop, and dump it onto the growing platform. The mud slaps down with a wet thud, splattering your tunic. The farmers grin at your clumsy effort, and you feel like the butt of a friendly joke. You've just made your microscopic contribution to Tenochtitlan's survival, even if it looks more like a mud fight than construction. The air fills with the sound of cicadas, and you notice women on a nearby chinampa laying out reed mats to dry. These mats will line the next garden, preventing soil from washing away. Children chase each other along the narrow paths, their laughter ringing across the water. Life here is communal. No single chinampa rises without many hands. The afternoon stretches on, and you paddle with your guide to a nearly finished chinampa. Rows of young maize already poke through the soil, green blades shimmering in the breeze. Squash plants sprawl low to the ground, and beans coil upward like lazy snakes. You realize that construction isn't a one-time act. It blends seamlessly into planting. There's no sharp line between building and growing. The two blur, just as water and land blur beneath your feet. As the sun dips lower, golden light pours across the lake. You hear the low croak of frogs and the splash of a fish breaking the surface. A canoe passes, piled high with harvested chilies, their red skins glowing like embers. The paddler whistles a tune, easy and unhurried, though you know his day began before dawn. You pause to take it all in. The smell of earth, the buzz of insects, the steady lap of water against wood. These gardens are alive in every sense, constructed, planted, harvested, celebrated. They're not just farmland. They're a living system that ties people, plants, and gods into a single rhythm. But as your eyelids grow heavy, one thought lingers. These chinampas are more than survival. They are symbols of balance between water and earth, labor and leisure, reverence and necessity. And standing here, mud on your sandals and reeds brushing your ankles, you realize that balance is fragile, always one storm away from collapse. Yet for now, under the Aztec sun, the gardens float, steady and strong. The morning haze burns away, and you watch sunlight scatter across the lake like shards of glass. Canoes are already gliding down the canals, paddles dipping rhythmically, carrying bundles of reeds and baskets of glistening vegetables. You've seen the chinampas built, but now your attention lingers on what makes them thrive day after day. The constant interplay between water and earth, the lake itself acting as both threat and salvation. You crouch at the edge of a chinampa, dipping your hand into the canal. The water is cool, silty, a little murky. Beneath its surface lies the secret of this whole system. Nutrients carried in silt, fish droppings, decayed vegetation, all of it feeding the soil above. Farmers dredge this sludge constantly, piling it on top of their chinampas, restoring fertility with every load. It's messy work, sure, but the payoff is astonishing. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The annual floods of Lake Texcoco regularly renewed the chinampas with fresh silt. Instead of fearing floods, the Aztecs bent them to their advantage, designing their plots and canals to channel rising waters into productivity. Where other civilizations built dams to fight nature, the Aztecs turned nature into their partner. You lean back against a willow tree, listening to its leaves whisper in the wind. A boy nearby drops a basket into the canal, scoops up dark muck, and dumps it onto the soil. The smell wafts toward you, sharp, fishy, slightly sour. You wrinkle your nose but remind yourself. That stench is the perfume of abundance. Quirky tidbit time. Some Aztec farmers believed the lake water itself held sacred power, and they whispered prayers into the ripples before dredging. Imagine, every scoop of muck accompanied by a whispered bargain with unseen forces. You find yourself watching the water a little more closely, half expecting it to whisper back. Historians still argue whether the balance of water and earth was carefully engineered from the start, or whether it was a gradual dance of trial and error. Did the Aztecs map it all out with mathematical precision, or did they stumble their way to genius over generations? Standing here, watching how naturally it all flows, you'd swear it was always meant to be this way. Like the lake and the gardens are old partners who've grown used to each other's moods. A heron stalks across the shallows, its long legs cutting through the reflection of clouds. Farmers ignore it, focused on their work. One man kneels to press bean seeds into moist soil, while a woman beside him scatters crushed lake weeds to hold moisture. The canal water seeps into the edges of the plot, keeping the ground damp even under the hot sun. No one needs hoses or pumps, the lake does the work. You can almost hear it sighing with patience, feeding everything quietly. You notice the rhythm of labor. In the mornings, dredging and planting. By noon, maintenance, checking for weeds, tying bean vines, gathering flowers for the market. And by late afternoon, harvest begins. Chilies glinting red, tomatoes fat and glossy, amaranth seeds like tiny golden beads. Each task flows into the next, guided by the constant pulse of the lake. At one chinampa, a family pauses for a meal. The mother unwraps tamales, steam rising into the warm air, while the father pours chocolatey atoll into clay cups. You accept a sip. It's warm, thick, lightly spiced with chili. The sweetness lingers, but so does the faint bitterness of cacao. It's a taste both comforting and startling, like a hug with a slap on the back. Children dart past with reed toys, their feet kicking up clumps of soil. One little boy almost topples into the canal, only to be hauled back by his older sister, who scolds him with an authority far beyond her years. Everyone laughs, but it's a reminder. The water that gives life can also take it. A single misstep, and you're wet, muddy, and embarrassed. Worse, you could be pulled under by the lake's murky grip. You paddle onward with a farmer who explains, in gestures more than words, how dredging prevents canals from clogging. Without constant clearing, water stagnates, weeds choke, and fish die. It's a cycle that demands vigilance. There's no such thing as set it and forget it here. Every chinampa is a living creature that must be fed, cleaned, and tended daily. As the sun dips lower, shadows stretch across the water, and you realize how the chinampas rely on both predictability and chaos. The rains bring renewal, but also risk of flooding. The canals provide irrigation, but also danger of erosion. The soil is fertile but fragile, always needing replenishment. It's a precarious balance, like spinning plates on sticks. Drop one, and the whole act wobbles. And yet, sitting there, lulled by the lap of water and the rustle of maize leaves, you feel the harmony more than the risk. The Aztecs had turned a lake into farmland, a marsh into a city's pantry. They had found a rhythm where others might only have found mud. You close your eyes, hearing the faint sound of drums drifting from the city center, carried across the water. The beat matches the sway of the canoe, the splash of paddles, the pulse of the lake itself. You breathe in damp air and think. Here, water and earth don't fight. They dance. The next morning, the lake's surface ripples with a faint breeze, and you drift toward a chinampa where maize stalks rise tall, their leaves rustling like paper in the wind. This is the crop you've been waiting to see, the one that holds the Aztec world together. Maize, corn if you're from the modern side of history. These stalks aren't just plants. They are the backbone of empire, the sacred foundation upon which cities and ceremonies balance. You crouch near a row where farmers work quickly, their hands moving with the precision of people who've planted maize since childhood. A woman presses kernels into moist soil, her fingers stained with earth, while a man follows with a clay jar of lake water, sprinkling just enough to dampen each hole. The rhythm is steady, hypnotic, and you almost forget how central these little yellow kernels are. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Maize was so vital to the Aztec diet that more than 2/3 of their calories came from it. Tortillas, tamales, atole, all daily staples, all built from corn. Without maize, there would have been no markets buzzing with trade, no soldiers marching on full stomachs, no priests making offerings of sacred dough. It wasn't just food, it was survival disguised as a humble grain. You lean in and pluck an ear from a stalk, its husk papery and light. Peel it back, and the kernels gleam like rows of polished teeth. The farmer smiles and gestures for you to taste. You bite into a roasted ear later that evening, its sweetness smoky, its flavor deep and earthy. Forget supermarket corn. This is maize with history, with centuries woven into its taste. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Aztec cooks treated maize with lime water in a process called nixtamalization. Sounds fancy, right? In reality, it's soaking and boiling corn in alkaline water, which unlocks vital nutrients like niacin and makes the dough pliable. Without it, maize-based diets risk malnutrition. With it, you get tamales, tortillas, and a population that can actually function without collapsing. So yes, the Aztecs were basically food chemists before food chemistry existed. You'd be chewing chalky kernels without them. Historians still argue whether maize was first cultivated in Mesoamerica as early as 9,000 years ago, or whether it spread later from localized experiments. Either way, by the time of the Aztecs, it had become not just a crop but a deity. You can almost hear whispers of prayers carried by the wind, offerings to Tenochtitlan, the maize god, whose image sometimes appeared with golden ears sprouting from his head. Corn wasn't just in the field, it was in the temples, in the myths, in the very flesh of the people who ate it daily. A child nearby hums while grinding dried kernels on a metate, the rhythmic scrape echoing across the chinampa. The flour will become masa, pressed into tortillas that puff over a clay griddle. You imagine the soft, warm disc in your hand, topped with beans or chilies, simple but perfect. Your modern taste buds cheer, but your sleepy brain knows it's more than flavor. It's culture baked flat and eaten 3 times a day. You glance at the stalks, noticing how they're planted in straight, almost military rows. There's efficiency here, but also a kind of reverence. Each stalk stands like a soldier, each tassel like a banner. And in a way, maize did fuel soldiers. Warriors carried dried corn cakes into battle, lightweight rations that kept them marching long after your stomach would have given up. The air grows warmer, and you catch the smell of roasting corn drifting from another chinampa. A group of farmers are sharing a midday snack, ears roasted over coals, brushed with chili paste, sprinkled with salt. They wave you over, and soon your hands are sticky, your lips tingling from spice. Someone cracks a joke you don't fully catch, but laughter ripples around you, easy and contagious. Corn, it seems, is also community. You remember a story you overheard in the market. Nobles would sometimes consume maize dyed blue, considered more sacred than yellow. Blue tortillas for the elite, everyday yellow for the common folk. Even in food, the layers of society peek through. Yet whether king or farmer, everyone depends on this same grain. Equality hides inside inequality, wrapped in a tortilla. As the sun lowers, you watch shadows stretch across the stalks. Their tips glow gold, and the sound of rustling leaves feels like applause. You realize that maize isn't just part of Aztec culture. It is the culture. From birth rituals with tiny ears of corn cradled in infants' hands to funeral offerings of maize dough, the plant follows people from cradle to grave. By now, your body hums with tired contentment, full of roasted kernels and warm tortillas. The canoe rocks gently, maize fields on both sides, the sky fading to crimson. You close your eyes, and in the darkness behind your lids, golden stalks still sway, whispering that without them, this floating city could never have existed. The next time you open your eyes, the maize stalks are still there, but now your gaze drops lower, to the vines that curl upward around their sturdy bodies. Beans, twisting and stubborn, reaching toward the sun as if climbing their older siblings. It's the second sister in the famous trio, And here on the chinampas, you can watch the partnership in real time. Maize giving height, beans giving protein, the two locked in a quiet embrace. A farmer waves you closer and shows you the vines up close. You see small, delicate flowers blooming along the stems, promising pods soon to come. He breaks one open, and the beans inside gleam smooth and round, pale green like little gems. These aren't just side dishes. They're nutritional lifelines, turning maize into more than a carb-heavy filler. Together, corn and beans form a complete protein, the kind your body craves but can't get from tortillas alone. A mainstream historical fact. The Aztec diet leaned heavily on beans for essential amino acids, making them the perfect counterpart to maize. Without this duo, the population would have been malnourished, soldiers too weak to march, farmers too tired to dredge canals. Beans may look humble, but they're the quiet workhorses of empire. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Farmers sometimes spoke of beans as climbers with manners. Why? Because unlike weeds, beans respected their maize hosts, wrapping upward without choking. It's like plant etiquette, a polite houseguest who borrows your ladder but doesn't trash the living room. If only your relatives at holiday dinners behaved half as well. Historians still argue whether the bean varieties found on Aztec chinampas came originally from the highlands or the lowlands of Mesoamerica. The debate trickles down to seed genetics, pottery residues, and the occasional charred pod found in archaeological digs. But standing here, you realize that for the farmers themselves, it hardly mattered where the beans came from. What mattered was how perfectly they fit into the trio of survival. You crouch lower, fingers brushing the damp soil where beans have been sown in careful rows between maize stalks. The air smells of greenery, moist earth, and faintly of chilly smoke drifting from a cooking fire nearby. A woman kneels at the edge of the plot, harvesting pods into a woven basket. She works quickly, humming a tune, pausing only to wipe her brow with her sleeve. Her hands move so surely it's as if she and the beans share an unspoken language. You're offered a clay bowl of frijoles freshly cooked, mashed, and mixed with chilies. The beans are soft, smoky, slightly salty. You scoop them with a tortilla and taste comfort. It's simple food, but also the sort of meal that fuels dawn-to-dusk labor. You chew slowly, realizing your modern protein shakes can't compete with beans grown from the earth, simmered with love, and eaten under the open sky. The children around you snack on roasted beans like peanuts, cracking the pods with their teeth. One boy grins, his cheeks bulging like a squirrel's. His sister teases him by dangling a bean pod just out of reach. They tumble onto the soil, laughing, while their mother pretends not to notice. Life here is full of work, yes, but also of small joys like bean snacks shared in the sun. You paddle along the canal and notice another farmer pulling up bean vines that have grown too tangled. He shakes his head, muttering something that sounds suspiciously like plant gossip. You imagine him grumbling. These beans just don't listen. And in a way, he's right. Sometimes the vines tangle in messy knots, making harvest more difficult. Even the politest houseguests can occasionally overstay their welcome. The late afternoon light turns golden, and you see families gathering for their main meal. Bowls of bean stew bubble over fires, thickened with maize flour, seasoned with chilies and herbs. The aroma drifts across the water, rich and inviting. You dip your tortilla into the stew, the beans warm and hearty, the broth clinging thick to your fingers. You lick them clean and laugh at yourself. You're not elegant, but you're satisfied. From nearby, the rhythmic sound of grinding fills the air. Women on their knees with metates, preparing more bean paste to mix into tamales. The scrape is steady, hypnotic, blending with the chirping of crickets and the gentle lap of water against the chinampas. You close your eyes, listening, letting the sound carry you. As the sun slips lower, shadows stretch long, and bean pods gleam faintly in the fading light. You think about their quiet role, never the centerpiece of feasts, never sculpted into temple offerings, but always there, always dependable. Beans may not have glory, but they have endurance. They are the friend who never leaves your side, the steady pulse beneath the flash and fire of Aztec life. By the time you climb into your canoe again, the stars are beginning to appear. The maize towers above you, the beans wind gracefully upward, and the water glimmers with reflected starlight. The night smells of soil and firewood, and a faint sweetness from blooming flowers. You drift into the dark, full of beans, both literally and figuratively. The sun peeks over the mountains, and today your eyes wander lower still, beneath the tall maize, below the curling beans, to the ground itself, where broad leaves creep outward across the soil. Squash, the third sister of the famous trio, stretches wide and stubborn, its vines snaking across the chinampa like lazy green arms. If maize is the proud soldier and beans the loyal friend, squash is the bodyguard sprawled on the floor, guarding everything from weeds, sun, and hungry pests. A farmer kneels beside one sprawling plant, lifting a leaf the size of your head. Beneath it hides a fat, ripening squash, its skin mottled green and gold, heavy with promise. He taps it with his knuckle, listening for the hollow sound that means it's ready. You lean in closer and catch the earthy scent of the vine, a mix of damp soil and faint sweetness. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Squash was cultivated in Mesoamerica thousands of years before the Aztecs, making it one of humanity's earliest domesticated plants. By the Aztec period, dozens of varieties thrived on the chinampas, pumpkins, gourds, zucchinis, each with a role in the diet and the kitchen. Roasted flesh, toasted seeds, even dried shells turned into bowls or rattles. Nothing went to waste. And now your quirky tidbit. Aztec healers sometimes used squash blossoms not just for eating, but for remedies. Steeped in water, they were thought to soothe stomach troubles. Imagine your modern doctor prescribing a pumpkin flower latte for indigestion. Not a bad deal, really. You'd get medicine and a snack in one. Historians still argue whether squash was valued more for its flesh or its seeds. The flesh could fill bellies with fiber and sweetness, but the seeds were nutrient-dense, rich in protein and oils. Some scholars suggest the seeds may have been the real prize, roasted and salted into crunchy little power bites. You, chewing on a handful offered by a laughing child, might agree. They taste like popcorn crossed with sunflower seeds, addictive enough that you keep sneaking more when you think no one's looking. You stroll along a row where squash vines tangle so thickly that walking is nearly impossible. Their broad leaves shade the soil, locking in moisture and discouraging weeds. You realize this is no accident, it's genius design. The three sisters aren't just roommates, they're co-conspirators. Maize gives the beans a ladder, beans feed nitrogen into the soil, and squash shields it all with leafy armor. Together, they're stronger than they'd ever be alone. A woman calls you over to a fire pit where slices of squash roast on clay griddles. The air smells sweet, almost caramelized. She flips a piece into your hand, still steaming. You bite carefully, the flesh soft and rich, like a cross between sweet potato and pumpkin pie filling. It warms your chest, satisfying in a way that feels ancient. You picture weary farmers biting into the same sweetness centuries ago, their muscles soothed, their hunger stilled. Nearby, children gather blossoms, bright yellow flowers plucked from vines. They stuff them with herbs and beans, fry them lightly, and pop them into their mouths. One boy hands you a blossom stuffed with chili and amaranth seeds. It's crunchy, spicy, floral, a flavor bomb in the middle of a floating garden. Who knew ancient snacks could rival your food truck back home? But there's humor here, too. Squash grows big, sometimes too big. Farmers tell stories of monstrous gourds that rolled off chinampas into canals, bobbing like fat green boats. One grinning elder claims he once rode one like a canoe as a boy. You're not sure if he's joking, but the image of a child paddling a giant pumpkin down a canal is enough to make you snort into your roasted slice. As the sun sinks, the vines turn darker green, blending with the twilight. Fireflies blink above the leaves, while frogs croak from hidden corners. The squash plants seem to sprawl endlessly, covering every inch of soil, as if tucking the chinampa into bed. You realize their role isn't just practical, it's protective, like a blanket laid lovingly over the earth. You lie back in your canoe, the night breeze carrying the scent of roasted squash and blossoms. Stars scatter above, reflected in the dark canals, while the broad leaves rustle softly. It's easy to imagine the plants whispering to each other, corn standing tall, beans climbing higher, squash sprawling wide, their voices weaving together like an old lullaby. By now, you understand why the Aztecs called them the Three Sisters. Alone, each crop might struggle. Together, they're family, feeding not just bodies but the rhythm of life itself. And under the quiet night sky, with your stomach full and your eyelids heavy, you feel like the fourth sibling, cradled in their leafy embrace. Morning mist curls across the canals, and as you drift along in your canoe, you notice patches of vivid green swaying gently in the water. These aren't just weeds, they're amaranth, the plant that managed to be both a staple food and a forbidden one. You paddle closer, watching thin stalks crowned with clusters of tiny seeds, glinting like bronze beads in the rising sun. The leaves are broad, smooth, and tender, shimmering with dew. They almost dare you to pluck a handful. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Amaranth was once a crucial crop for the Aztecs, nearly as important as maize itself. Its seeds could be ground into flour, popped like popcorn, or mixed with honey to make sweet cakes. Its leaves, high in nutrients, were cooked into stews or eaten fresh. The plant grew quickly, thrived in poor soils, and produced both food and ritual offerings. In many ways, it was a miracle plant. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Aztec priests sometimes mixed amaranth flour with human blood during sacred ceremonies, shaping it into edible figurines of gods. These figures would be broken and eaten by worshippers, a ritual blending nourishment and devotion. Imagine biting into a cookie shaped like your favorite deity, then realizing it's been sprinkled with something a little more metallic. Historians still argue whether Spanish conquerors banned amaranth solely because of its religious associations, or because it threatened wheat's place in colonial diets. Either way, the ban was fierce. Farmers caught growing it risked punishment. Yet, like a stubborn weed, amaranth never truly disappeared. It lingered quietly in hidden plots, waiting centuries to make a comeback. And now, in your modern world, it's been rebranded as a trendy superfood. Funny how history cycles back, like an old meme that never dies. You glide past a farmer kneeling in his canoe, harvesting the seeds with a careful shake of the stalk. They rain into his basket like golden dust, whispering as they fall. He grins, showing you a cake made from popped amaranth bound with honey, shiny and sticky. You bite, and the crunch is loud, the sweetness deep, like a nutty granola bar from a health food aisle. Only this one predates your energy snacks by half a millennium. Nearby, women stir steaming pots over clay stoves, tossing amaranth leaves into broths rich with herbs and chilies. The air fills with an earthy, spinach-like aroma, sharper than maize, fresher than beans. You sip from a wooden bowl, and the broth tastes like spring captured in liquid form. The heat seeps into your belly, calming, grounding. Children giggle as they pop seeds directly over the fire, kernels bursting with soft puffs. One boy shoves a handful into your palm, and you can't resist tossing them into your mouth. They're airy, nutty, strangely addictive. You laugh with him, scattering a few into the canal, where ducks start to snatch them before they sink. The ritual side of amaranth still lingers here, too. A young priestess presses seeds into a small figurine shaped like Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god. She places it gently before an altar of flowers, her lips murmuring prayers. You watch quietly, the crackling fire and soft chants mixing into the rhythm of the morning. For a moment, you feel the plant's double life, both sustenance and symbol, food for stomach and soul. Then there's the humor, always. An elder tells you how, during certain festivals, children were encouraged to eat so many amaranth cakes they ended up sticky from head to toe. He chuckles about boys with honey-glued hair and girls with seed-speckled cheeks, everyone laughing while pretending to be living figurines. You can't help but imagine a chaotic, ancient bake-off where the prize was an unshakable sugar rush. As the day stretches, the fields glow with amaranth stalks swaying like scarlet feathers. The canals carry their reflection, a rippling mirror of reds and greens. Birds dive in for seeds, their wings stirring the air with gentle flutters. Farmers tie bundles together, stacking them high like little pyramids, each one humming with the promise of food, medicine, and memory. You lean back in your canoe, chewing the last sticky bite of a honey cake, and think about how something as small as a seed could shape history. Forbidden, forgotten, reborn. It feels like a survivor's tale told in edible form. The mist has burned away now, replaced by the steady warmth of the sun, and the amaranth seems to glow brighter, almost defiant, as though saying, "You can ban me, but you'll never erase me." The canal bends, and you find yourself floating into a patch where the air smells sweet and grassy, tinged with the faint bite of herbs. There, in neat rows upon raised beds, stand stalks of chia. You might know it today from mason jars and Instagram posts, the infamous chia pudding or those chia pet commercials. But here, centuries earlier, the Aztecs grew it as a sacred seed, one small grain carrying surprising weight. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Chia was one of the 4 staple crops of the Aztec world, alongside maize, beans, and amaranth. Its seeds were rich in omega-3 fatty acids, protein, and fiber, nutritional gold long before nutritionists started writing glossy diet blogs. Warriors carried chia on campaigns because a handful could sustain them for an entire day. Think of it as the original power bar, minus the foil wrapper. For the quirky tidbit, you discover that chia wasn't just eaten. It was pressed into oil, used as body paint, rubbed into skin as a cosmetic, and even burned in lamps. Imagine lighting your study desk with a chia-powered flame, or moisturizing with the same stuff you'd sprinkle on cereal. Multipurpose doesn't even begin to cover it. Historians still argue whether chia was cultivated more for its daily sustenance or for its ritual significance. Some accounts suggest it was offered as tribute to the emperor by conquered regions, nearly as valuable as cacao. Others hint it was tied to the worship of Chicamcotl, the maize goddess, linking tiny seeds to the rhythm of fertility and harvest. The truth? Probably both, but no one can prove it outright. You crouch on a floating mat of earth, running your fingers through the delicate plants. Their leaves are soft, slightly fuzzy, the stalks slender and green. At the tops, tiny blossoms open into pale purple, waving like shy bells in the breeze. When farmers gather the seeds, they look like glittering grains of obsidian dust, light yet heavy with promise. A woman shows you how she scoops a few into her palm, tosses them into water, and within minutes the seeds swell into translucent orbs, a slick gel forming around each one. She stirs it with honey and lime, handing you a clay cup. You sip, and the drink is oddly refreshing. It slides down your throat like a thin jelly, sweet and tangy, the gelled seeds popping faintly against your tongue. Suddenly you understand why messengers, running mile after mile between cities, carried this simple mixture. It's basically Aztec Gatorade. Nearby, children laugh as they rub chia paste onto their arms, pretending to be fierce warriors covered in ritual paint. One boy flexes dramatically, declaring himself invincible thanks to his chia muscles. You can't help but chuckle. Imagine an ancient playground advertisement. Eat your chia, kids, and grow strong enough to wrestle jaguars. As you watch, a priestess carefully sprinkles chia seeds into a ceremonial fire. They hiss and pop, releasing a faint aroma, like toasted nuts. Smoke curls upward, thin and silvery, carrying prayers into the sky. Farmers kneel silently, heads bowed, asking for fertile seasons. In the hush, you realize how fragile these rituals are, tied to seeds so small, they can scatter with a single careless breeze. And then comes the contrast you can't ignore. You think about how chia disappeared from mainstream use for centuries after the conquest, only to return centuries later, marketed with bright labels and wellness slogans. The irony is almost comedic. A plant once fueling warriors and gods is now part of detox cleanses, sold in juice bars for $15 a glass. Somewhere, an Aztec farmer would be shaking his head, muttering, "You're paying how much for that?" Still, standing here on the chinampa, you can't help but feel a sense of reverence. The seeds catch the sunlight, tiny pearls clinging to your damp fingers. They are fragile, yes, but they endure, just as the farmers who nurtured them endured through storms, floods, and empires that rose and fell. You set your empty cup aside, wiping your lips as the canal breeze rustles the chia plants, whispering like a soft lullaby. You lean back, watching a bird swoop down, peck at the blossoms, and dart away. The ripples spread across the water, and for a moment, you imagine yourself one of those seeds, small, overlooked, but capable of swelling into something much greater when given time, water, and patience. The path along the chinampa leads you into a stretch where tall stalks sway above your head, their feathered tassels catching the sunlight like gold threads. This is maize country, the absolute heart of Aztec agriculture, and frankly, the backbone of the entire civilization. Everywhere you look, corn is present, roasted on hearths, ground into tortillas, kneaded into tamales, and simmered in stews. It's impossible to overstate it. Without maize, there is no Aztec empire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Maize was not just food, it was cosmology. The Aztecs believed humanity itself was made from ground corn, kneaded by the gods into flesh. You, standing there, are essentially walking corn dough in their worldview. That makes every harvest more than survival. It's reaffirmation of existence. Each cob is a mirror of human life. Now for the quirky tidbit. Maize wasn't just yellow like the cobs you see in supermarkets today. The chinampas shimmer with rainbow rows, deep red ears, pale white ones, speckled purple, even striped kernels like candy canes. Imagine wandering a farmer's market where every stall looks like a display from a bag of Skittles. Aztec cooks knew each color carried its own flavor, texture, and sometimes ritual use. A red cob for offerings, a white one for feasts, a blue one ground into a sacred drink. Historians still argue whether maize was first domesticated in one single valley of Mexico or spread gradually through multiple regions, hybridizing over centuries. Archaeological evidence leans toward one origin point, but some insist the genetic story is Messier, a patchwork quilt stitched together by countless farmers' hands. Either way, by the time you're standing here in the Valley of Mexico, maize has already been perfected into dozens of landraces, each tailored for specific soils, climates, and rituals. A farmer invites you to join him, pressing a cob into your hands. It's heavy, cool, the kernels tightly packed, like golden teeth grinning at you. He shows you how his family grinds it using a matate, the rhythmic stone-on-stone sound echoing across the chinampa like a slow heartbeat. Flour gathers in little piles, soft as talcum. Then, with a practiced motion, his wife pats the flour into discs, tossing them onto a clay griddle over coals. The smell is immediate, warm, earthy sweet. You take a bite of the fresh tortilla, and suddenly all modern tortillas you've eaten feel like pale imitations. This one is chewy, rich, smoky, a perfect vessel for beans, chili, or nothing at all. Children nearby play a game with dried corn cobs, tossing them through hoops made from reeds. It looks a little like basketball in slow motion, though with much less dunking and more giggling. You imagine a modern PE teacher trying to explain corn cob toss as a fitness routine. Parents would revolt, but kids would probably be thrilled. Your guide points out how maize is stored. Instead of leaving it in baskets to mold, farmers husk the ears, tie them in clusters, and hang them from rafters, forming golden chandeliers swaying in the breeze. These aren't just decorations, they're insurance policies against famine. He explains that in lean years, these stores could mean the difference between life and death. You realize that every cob is a kind of currency, fuel for both belly and empire. And maize wasn't just food, it was chemistry. The Aztecs used a process we now call nixtamalization, soaking maize in lime water before grinding it. This unlocked vital nutrients, especially niacin, preventing diseases like pellagra that later devastated European populations who adopted corn without learning the trick. In other words, the Aztecs had nutritional biochemistry nailed centuries before lab coats. Imagine them giving a TED Talk, How to Prevent Malnutrition with a Pinch of Lime. Another ritual unfolds. A priest sprinkles maize kernels onto water, watching them float and spin. The pattern is read like tea leaves, a divination of the coming season. Will rains be generous? Will storms flatten crops? Each floating kernel is a whisper from the gods. You watch, amused but also struck by the poetry. How a grain of corn can become a prophecy. And then the irony sets in again. In modern times, maize has been twisted into high-fructose corn syrup, snack bags, and industrial livestock feed. Billions of tons churned out annually, stripped of its sacred shimmer, pumped into sodas and neon-orange chips. You glance back at the rainbow cobs drying in the sun here on the Chinampa, and it feels like you're staring at a lost art form. Somewhere, a white and gold cob mutters under its husk, "This is not what I signed up for." Still, here, the respect is palpable. Every ear is touched with gratitude, every tortilla born from song and ritual. Farmers hum as they work, women pat dough in rhythm, and children chase each other between rows of towering stalks. The Chinampa vibrates with life, rooted in maize. You chew the last bite of your tortilla, tasting not just food, but history itself pressed flat and warmed in fire. The sun slides lower, glinting on tassels like 1,000 golden feathers, and you lean back, belly satisfied, ears ringing with the hum of a world where corn is not filler but foundation. For a fleeting moment, you believe the Aztecs were right. You are made of maize, warm and fragile, baked into the story of this floating land. The maize fields fade behind you, and now the Chinampa shifts in texture. Rows break into patches, and you find yourself stepping among deep green squash vines sprawling like lazy snakes across the soil. Their tendrils curl around stakes, their broad leaves flap gently like umbrellas, and beneath them, plump fruits peek shyly, some striped, some pale, some so round and orange they look like little suns fallen to earth. You kneel, brush away a leaf, and discover a blossom the size of your palm, bright yellow and delicate as silk. The air smells faintly sweet, tinged with the earthiness of raw pumpkin flesh. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Squash, along with maize and beans, made up the famed Three Sisters of Mesoamerican agriculture. This trio was genius. Corn offered tall stalks for beans to climb, beans fixed nitrogen into the soil, and squash spread wide to suppress weeds and lock in moisture. In modern sustainability jargon, it's a permaculture system perfected centuries ago, but to the Aztecs, it was simply life, elegant and practical. Now, the quirky tidbit. Aztecs didn't just eat the squash flesh. They roasted the seeds, ground them into sauces, and even pressed them for oil. Imagine your pumpkin spice latte, except without the sugar avalanche. More like a rich, nutty pumpkin seed drink whipped up by a farmer's wife on a chilly morning. They also stuffed blossoms with herbs and cheese-like curds, then fried them on hot stones. That's right, the Aztecs basically invented stuffed squash blossoms long before Instagram foodies made them a thing. Historians still argue whether certain squashes, like the massive hard-shelled gourds, were cultivated first for food or for containers. Some evidence suggests early farmers dried them into natural bowls and bottles before realizing, hey, this thing tastes pretty good too. So the debate is half culinary, half IKEA catalog. A farmer gestures for you to help him harvest. He hands you a gourd-shaped squash, cool and heavy, its ridges smooth against your skin. He explains that once dried, this very shape becomes a canteen for carrying water on long journeys, proof that plants can double as survival gear. You hoist it to your ear jokingly, pretending it's a medieval cell phone. The farmer laughs, though you're not sure if he's laughing at the joke or just at your clumsy grip. Nearby, women roast seeds on clay comales, their snapping husks filling the air with a popcorn-like aroma. You're offered a handful, warm and salted with ash. They crunch between your teeth, earthy and oily, addictive. Suddenly, modern pumpkin seeds in plastic bags seem dull and sterile. This handful is alive with flavor, pulsing with history. You grab a few more, pretending it's for research, but really it's just because they're ridiculously good. Then comes the meal. A stew simmers in a clay pot. Squash chunks stewed with beans and chilies, thick and hearty, served with fresh tortillas. The combination is simple yet balanced, each bite a harmony of sweetness, spice, and smokiness. You wonder if Michelin inspectors had wandered into Tenochtitlan. Would they have awarded chinampas stars? Probably, though they'd grumble about having to row a canoe to dinner. Children nearby hollow out small gourds, painting faces with soot and chalk. They aren't carving jack-o'-lanterns exactly, but you get the sense that people across centuries can't resist the urge to turn squashes into toys or decorations. It's like the universal human instinct. Big round fruit must make silly face. Your guide points to a mound where squash vines intertwine with maize stalks and bean tendrils. He calls it a living mat, a blanket thrown by the gods across the soil. You crouch, running your fingers over the layers, and feel how the leaves trap humidity, how the roots knit soil tight. It's not just a farm, it's an ecological tapestry, woven so seamlessly that you wonder why modern farms look like sterile grids in comparison. The sun catches on a massive squash, its orange skin glowing like molten metal. Your guide explains that these giant fruits are stored for months, their thick rinds keeping flesh edible deep into winter. They're like ancient refrigerators without plugs, stacked in huts as orange pyramids. Each squash is both food and time capsule, carrying summer's sunlight into the coldest days. You're reminded, too, of how squash traveled. From these floating gardens, seeds spread across the Americas, reshaping diets everywhere they landed. Fast forward centuries, and squash becomes pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving, zucchini spirals on Instagram, jack-o'-lanterns glowing on suburban porches. Every bite of fall nostalgia traces back to vines curling across chinampas in a sunlit lake. You smirk, imagining an Aztec farmer watching a modern pumpkin spice marketing campaign. He'd probably shake his head, mutter seriously, and then sip his unsweetened pumpkin seed drink with quiet superiority. Still, the respect lingers here. Every seed roasted, every blossom stuffed, every gourd carved. It's all done with reverence, as if the squash is a guest at the table rather than an ingredient. The blossoms flutter in the breeze, lanterns of gold, while vines creep endlessly, rooting this floating world with their stubborn green grip. You lie back for a moment, letting the shade of their leaves cool your face, and hear the whisper of wind through tendrils, like nature humming itself to sleep. And in that moment, you realize squash is more than food. It is shelter, container, celebration, and plaything. It is orange sun and green shade, autumn and spring in one sprawling patch. And here, on the chinampa, it continues to sprawl, patient, generous, quietly eternal. You step carefully over the vines of squash until the green fades into another patch of life, beans. Not neat little supermarket beans sealed in plastic, but long, graceful runners twining themselves up poles and maize stalks, curling like dancers caught mid-spiral. Their pods dangle in clusters, some tender and slim, others fat and bulging with seeds. You reach for one, the texture slightly fuzzy, and when you split it open with your thumb, the beans gleam like tiny jewels, white, black, speckled, each color carrying its own story. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Beans in the Valley of Mexico came in many varieties, but the most commonly grown were black beans, loved for their protein and their rich, earthy flavor. Alongside maize and squash, they created a nutritional powerhouse. Combined, they gave nearly complete protein, meaning a person could stay strong without meat. For a civilization where hunting large game wasn't the norm, that combo was survival in edible form. Now the quirky tidbit. Beans weren't only for eating. Aztecs used bean-counting games, much like dice. You'd toss a handful onto a mat, and depending on how they landed, you'd win or lose. Imagine poker night on a chinampa, except instead of chips, everyone's nervously eyeing a pile of beans. Some priests even used beans in divination rituals, scattering them like modern fortune tellers shuffle tarot cards. If your future was bean-shaped, you just had to roll with it. Historians still argue whether beans were first domesticated in the Mexican highlands or imported from further south in Central America. The evidence overlaps like tangled vines, and scholars toss theories back and forth like, well, beans. Either way, by the time of the Aztecs, beans had been nurtured into dozens of landraces, each suited to specific soils and climates. A woman squats by a clay pot, stirring black beans as they simmer with chilies and herbs. She invites you to taste. The stew is smoky, slightly sweet, and deeply filling. The beans melt against your tongue, leaving behind a grounding warmth. It's not fancy food. It's comfort food, the kind you could eat every day without tiring. You realize this might have been the emotional core of Aztec cooking. The steady, reassuring hum beneath the fireworks of chili salsas and roasted maize. Your guide gestures toward a lattice of maize stalks, their bases ringed by bean vines. He explains that beans climb naturally, spiraling toward sunlight, while their roots pull nitrogen from the air and feed it into the soil. You crouch, tug a little at the roots, and imagine invisible strands of nutrition spreading through the earth, keeping the chinampa fertile. Without beans, the system would collapse into exhaustion. They're quiet workers, humble in appearance, yet vital. The kind of plant that never brags but holds the whole household together. Then comes a curious experiment. A farmer splits open several bean pods and arranges the seeds in a small dish. He claims each color represents a mood or energy. Black for protection, white for clarity, speckled for transition. He shakes the dish, lets the beans scatter on a reed mat, and squints at the patterns. He tells you, in a half-smile, that your future looks mixed, which feels suspiciously vague, like the Aztec version of a horoscope. Still, you play along, pretending to take it very seriously, because who wants to anger a man with bean-based foresight? Nearby, children munch roasted beans, crunching them like modern trail mix. Others pound dried beans with stones, making flour to thicken sauces. You're reminded how versatile they are: fresh, dried, roasted, mashed, stewed. They can store for years, waiting silently in jars until famine or winter arrives. You suddenly respect beans as little time travelers, patient and indestructible, biding their moment to become dinner. A memory surfaces of the three sisters we saw earlier: corn, beans, squash, a trio so symbiotic it borders on poetic. You think of them like a band. Maize is the tall lead singer, squash is the sprawling bass line, and beans are the harmonizing backup vocals that hold the melody steady. Without beans, the song would fall flat. And yet, beans aren't always cooperative. You learn that if they're overcooked in unlined pots, they can release bitterness. Farmers here solve this by adding a pinch of limestone ash or herbs, balancing the flavor, turning potential disaster into nourishment. It's culinary problem-solving at its most practical, chemistry disguised as kitchen wisdom. The sun lowers, casting golden light on the dangling pods, which sway like lanterns in the breeze. You pluck another handful, imagining how these same beans might one day end up across oceans, reshaping European diets, finding their way into cassoulet and Tuscan stews. It's humbling to think that the humble chinampa bean would someday star on dinner tables thousands of miles away. You sit cross-legged, chew thoughtfully, and admit something out loud. Beans are not glamorous, but they are honest. They don't show off like chilies or demand attention like maize. They simply endure, feeding, fertilizing, sustaining. If squash is the cheerful cousin and maize the proud patriarch, then beans are the quiet caretaker who keeps the family alive. And in this floating garden, under the hush of evening, that seems more than enough. You pause at the edge of the chinampa, where the air feels wetter, cooler. There's a low mist rising, and out of it tall, waxy leaves shimmer under droplets of water. At first, you think it's just reeds, but then you notice the broad, lush heads curling out of the stalks, greens. Amaranth leaves, lettuce-like quilites, and strange herbs that look like spinach's wild cousins. You lean closer and smell something grassy, earthy, a bit sharp, like biting into raw kale. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Amaranth was one of the great staple crops of Mesoamerica, cultivated not just for its seeds but also for its leaves. These leaves, nutrient-dense, iron-rich, were sautéed, boiled, or folded into tamales. Paired with maize, they offered a vitamin boost that kept people strong. In Aztec markets, bundles of greens were as common as maize cakes, each wrapped in reeds to keep them fresh. And now the quirky tidbit. Not every green was farmed. Many were wild quilites, essentially edible weeds that sprouted between rows of beans and squash. Instead of pulling them up, Aztec farmers treated them like little gifts, ready to eat, no planting required. Imagine if modern gardeners bragged, "I don't weed, I harvest gourmet side dishes." Quilites were so abundant that some scholars joke they were the salad bars of the chinampa world. Historians still argue whether amaranth was more valued for its leaves or its seeds. Seeds were used in festivals, molded with honey into ritual figures that the Spanish later banned for being too pagan. But in daily life, the leaves may have fed more mouths, slipping quietly into stews when grain stores ran low. The debate continues, with archaeologists sifting pollen grains like detectives piecing together a half-forgotten recipe. You crouch and pluck a handful of fresh amaranth leaves. Their texture is soft yet slightly rubbery. You nibble one raw. It's peppery, almost metallic, like spinach with attitude. A farmer nearby laughs and tells you to wait until they're cooked. Raw, they're only for the desperate or impatient. Sure enough, when he tosses them in a clay pot with squash blossoms and chilies, the flavor deepens, turning mellow and slightly sweet. Further along, you spot another patch, Wazental, with its tiny clustered buds, almost like broccoli crossed with a feather duster. Women pluck the tops, dip them in batter, and fry them on hot griddles, the scent sizzling into the evening. You imagine biting into one, the crunch giving way to a soft, grassy interior. It's not just food, it's texture play, something chefs today would call culinary contrast. Your guide points out a stand of watercress near the canal's edge, its leaves dipping into the flow. He warns you, watercress here grows wild, but it must be plucked carefully, away from the muddy runoff where animals drink. You can almost hear 1,000 worried mothers nagging their kids. Not that one, the clean one over there. Even in the Aztec world, food safety was a thing. Then there are herbs that double as medicine. Epazote, with its jagged leaves and pungent aroma, was tossed into bean pots not just for taste but to reduce, let's call it politely, the side effects of beans. You crush a leaf between your fingers and wince. It smells like gasoline mixed with mint. Yet in cooking, it mellows, adding a savory depth. Some healers also brewed it into tea for stomach aches. You imagine the dual benefit: fewer awkward bean-related noises and a calmer belly. A child runs past holding a bundle of quintonil, grinning as if it were treasure. His mother boils it, drains it, then folds it into tortillas. You take a bite of one and notice how the green balances the corn's sweetness, like a duet where neither voice overwhelms the other. It's light, refreshing, a reminder that meals didn't always have to be heavy stews or roasted maize. Sometimes simplicity ruled. Your mind drifts to modern salads. You picture plastic clamshells of baby spinach flown halfway across the world. Then you look down at these chinampa greens, cut hours ago, eaten within steps of where they grew. You wonder if the Aztecs might laugh at our obsession with farm-to-table, as if it's some innovation. For them, it was just dinner. And here's another playful note. Some greens doubled as dye. Amaranth leaves could stain cloth a faint red, while others gave pale yellows. So yes, you could eat your wardrobe, or wear your lunch, depending on mood. Fashionable and practical. Though historians still argue whether that was intentional or simply a side effect of laundry gone wrong. As twilight deepens, fireflies flicker among the leaves, tiny lanterns turning the greens into a glowing carpet. You sit, chewing slowly, realizing how overlooked this part of the diet might be. Everyone talks about maize and cacao, but these greens were daily fuel, invisible scaffolding holding up Aztec health. Without them, diets might have been bland, nutrient-poor, monotonous. With them, meals gained brightness, variety, a whisper of freshness. Your last bite of stewed amaranth surprises you. It's comforting, tender, and more satisfying than you expected. The greens don't dazzle like chocolate or thrill like chilies, but they soothe. They're the quiet lull in a song, the steady note that carries the melody forward. And in a city of stone and ritual, that softness must have mattered too. You rise early, before the chinampa farmers stir, and the first light paints the canals silver. The air smells damp and green, like earth just turned over. As you walk, you hear the faint scuttling of claws against wet soil. At the water's edge, a farmer crouches with a basket and lifts out a twitching, long-bodied creature, an axolotl. Mainstream fact first, axolotls, those legendary walking fish, were once abundant in the lakes around Tenochtitlan. They're not fish at all, but amphibians, cousins of salamanders. The Aztecs valued them as a steady source of protein, easy to catch, and often roasted, stewed, or wrapped in tamales. Imagine unwrapping a steaming maize husk and finding one inside. Strange to you, but everyday nourishment to them. Now for the quirky tidbit. Axolotls never grew up. Literally. They stayed in a state of eternal youth, gilled and finned, refusing to transform into their land-dwelling form. For the Aztecs, this stubborn refusal echoed myth. They believed the god Xolotl, twin of Quetzalcoatl, transformed into the axolotl to escape sacrifice. You're basically eating a divine fugitive. No pressure. Historians still argue whether axolotls were raised deliberately in pens or just harvested wild. Some evidence points to controlled breeding along chinampa edges, where shallow, sheltered pools allowed easy capture. Others insist that farmers simply took what nature provided, scooping them up during calm mornings. Like so much with Aztec farming, the truth may be a blend of both, managed abundance rather than strict domestication. You peer into the farmer's basket. The axolotls are strange, almost alien, with feathery gills splayed like underwater fireworks. One blinks at you, unbothered, as though resigned to its fate. Later, in a clay pot, its pale flesh turns tender, described by chroniclers as tasting somewhere between fish and frog. You take a cautious bite. The texture is soft, flaky, with a faint sweetness. If you close your eyes, you could mistake it for cod. Next to the axolotls come frogs. Small, plump, green-speckled amphibians hopping through the reeds, easy prey for quick hands. A boy leaps into the mud, catching two in one swoop. These frogs, too, are destined for the pot, often fried until crisp. Their legs, skinny but flavorful, were chewed on like crunchy snacks. Think of it as Aztec bar food, frogs and maize beer instead of wings and lagers. Fish flash beneath the canal's surface. You spot tilapia-like species, though the Aztecs had their own native varieties. Whitefish, chub, carp-like swimmers. Nets weighted with stones are drawn in, heavy with a morning's catch. The fish are gutted, cleaned, then either roasted or dried in the sun for storage. The dried version, called char alesh, could be crumbled into stews or chewed as a salty bite on long journeys. You taste one, brittle and briny, and think of modern jerky, except this one swims instead of grazes. One fisherman holds up a fat salamander, its skin slick and glistening. He chuckles at your hesitation, insisting it's prized for its richness. You wonder if this is bravado, or if centuries of eating things wriggly have simply built a palate beyond your comfort zone. Still, you chew politely. The flavor isn't bad, earthy, slightly musky, but carried by the smoky wood fire, it passes. Quirky side note, some fish and frogs weren't eaten at all, but used in rituals. Frogs croaking were seen as heralds of rain, sometimes sacrificed to coax the skies open. In a world dependent on chinampa canals, that chorus wasn't just background noise. It was divine weather forecasting. Scholars debate whether these animals were everyday meals for commoners or delicacies reserved for city markets. One Spanish friar insisted only nobles dined on axolotls, while another noted baskets of them sold cheaply in crowded stalls. The truth is probably both. Status shifted depending on supply. Some days, you were lucky enough to have a noble's dish. Other days, frogs filled the gap when maize ran thin. You notice how nothing here goes to waste. Fish heads flavor broths. Frog bones enrich stock. Even the odd offal is tossed into tamales. The ecosystem itself cycles into food seamlessly. Chinampas weren't just gardens, but buffets of land and water combined. A farmer tells you about turtles, too. Small freshwater ones, roasted whole, cracked open like crunchy shells hiding tender meat. You imagine a feast of mixed catch. Fish grilled, frogs fried, axolotls stewed, turtles roasted. A banquet of the wetlands. For modern palates, it might feel exotic, maybe unsettling, but for the Aztecs it was Tuesday. As dusk falls, you sit by a canal and hear the croak of frogs mixing with the splash of fish. You imagine the city lit with torches, nobles feasting on golden platters, commoners chewing dried minnows by candlelight, and all of them connected by the same lake, the same watery larder. The final bite tonight? An axolotl tamale, rich, smoky, slightly chewy, but filling. You lean back, chewing slowly, realizing that in this watery world, nothing with legs, fins, or gills went unconsidered. To survive here, you ate the lake itself. The dawn haze lifts over the chinampa fields, and today you're invited to step inside a different kind of kitchen. Not one with pots simmering or tamales steaming, but the city's market itself. This is where the produce grown on those floating gardens doesn't just get eaten. It gets traded, bartered, and sold in a spectacle so vast you'll wonder how anyone even kept track. You approach Tlatelolco, the grandest market of the Aztec world, and it's buzzing like a modern shopping mall, except without the neon lights and bad food courts. Instead, you hear the sharp calls of vendors hawking their wares, the clatter of clay jars, the scent of grilled fish, and piles upon piles of vegetables, direct from the chinampas you trudged through yesterday. Mainstream fact to ground us. Spanish chroniclers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo described this market as having upwards of 60,000 people on peak days. That's basically a pop-up city inside the capital, a whirlpool of trade where chinampa produce formed the backbone of daily commerce. Tomatoes stacked in baskets, chili peppers bundled like little torches, squash piled in neat pyramids. Every color, every shape, every texture you can imagine. You reach for a tomato, round, glossy, deep red, much smaller than the beefsteaks you know. A vendor slices one, sprinkles ground chili, and hands it to you. It bursts with tang, sweet and sharp. You think of salsa, and realize you're literally tasting its ancestor. The farmer beams, proud that this humble fruit still dazzles newcomers 5 centuries later. Quirky tidbit? There were actually official inspectors roaming this market, like Aztec food police. They made sure your tomatoes weren't spoiled, your chilies weren't watered down, and your squash wasn't undersized. Imagine someone fining you for selling subpar avocados. Historians still argue whether these inspectors were more like helpful regulators or terrifying enforcers with whips at the ready. Either way, quality control was serious business. Beyond fresh produce, you notice dried goods, seeds, herbs, and spices neatly portioned into gourds. Amaranth seed, toasted and nutty, poured into buyers' baskets. Chia, sold by the spoonful, promising energy for warriors. You try a sip of chia mixed in water. It swells into a gelatinous texture that slides down your throat. Not exactly your iced latte, but strangely refreshing. Squash blossoms, bright yellow and delicate, are sold in bundles for soups and quesadillas. Yes, pre-Columbian quesadillas existed in their own form. A woman tucks a few into her basket, already planning her evening meal. You smell roasted maize in the air, tortillas slapped hot off griddles, proof that chinampa harvests don't just end in raw sales, but transform instantly into meals for anyone hungry enough to buy. The market isn't only food. Woven mats, obsidian knives, cotton cloaks, all sit beside baskets of vegetables. That's because chinampa surplus was powerful currency. A family growing extra chilies could swap them for salt, pottery, or even a little jewelry. The floating gardens didn't just feed mouths, they fed the entire trade system. Historians debate whether common farmers really profited much, or whether the state's tribute system skimmed off most of the wealth. Some say farmers kept a decent share for the market. Others argue the nobility demanded the best and left peasants with scraps. You watch a farmer tuck his few coins into his cloak after selling squash, and you can't quite tell if his smile is relief or resignation. Still, the market hums with life. Everywhere you turn, trade buzzes. A boy holds a frog in one hand and haggles for a basket of chilies. A woman weighs amaranth against cacao beans, the empire's closest thing to universal money. A noble strides by, attendants carrying baskets piled high with fresh flowers and vegetables, while commoners squat low to sell handfuls of herbs. It's the whole social ladder compressed into one square. You pause at a stall where roasted chilies smoke the air. The vendor grins, daring you to try one. You pop it into your mouth and immediately regret it. Your tongue feels like it's been set on fire, your eyes water, and your ears ring. The vendor laughs so hard he nearly spills his beans, literally. You grab a gulp of maize drink, cooling the blaze, and mutter something about needing hazard pay for this history tour. Quirky observation. The Aztecs didn't really do small talk shopping like modern supermarkets. Haggling was expected, and deals were sealed with loud banter. You'd better be ready to argue or risk paying double. As you stumble away from the chili stall, you realize your negotiating skills are about as weak as your spice tolerance. As the day winds down, the market shifts. Produce that hasn't sold gets bundled back into canoes. Some will be eaten at home, some fed to animals, some dried for storage. Nothing truly wastes here. The cycle continues, water to garden, garden to market, market to belly. By evening, you leave Tlatelolco, ears still ringing with shouts, mouth still tingling from chili. Behind you, the market glows with torches, a bustling stage where chinampas become commerce. You realize the floating gardens didn't just feed people. They fueled one of the busiest, most organized markets in the pre-modern world. And as you trudge back to your canoe, you can't help thinking, Amazon Prime has nothing on this place. The canoe drifts quietly as you leave the clamor of the market, but your thoughts refuse to settle. You keep replaying the sight of baskets stacked with chilies, pyramids of squash, neat rows of tomatoes, like little edible soldiers lined up for duty. But the thing that really strikes you isn't just the abundance. It's how each vegetable carved out its own niche in daily life. Tonight, you get to linger on their roles, not just as food, but as characters with personalities in the Aztec story. Take maize. Always maize. It's more than a crop, it's the backbone, the default setting. Tortillas wrap nearly every meal, tamales stuff the stomachs of builders and warriors alike, and maize drinks flow like ancient smoothies. You munch on a warm tortilla, lightly charred, and realize this grain wasn't just nutrition. It was myth, religion, identity. The Aztecs believed humans were literally created from maize dough, kneaded by gods. Imagine walking around thinking you're basically a divine corn muffin. Kind of humbling, kind of hilarious. But maize didn't hog the spotlight. Beans quietly stepped in to balance the diet. Protein-packed, versatile, and always dependable. You picture clay pots simmering with black beans, flavored with herbs, ready to scoop onto tortillas. They might not look glamorous, but without beans, all that maize would leave you nutritionally stranded. It's the eternal duo, maize and beans, Aztec history's peanut butter and jelly. Now squash, chunky, hearty, and surprisingly diverse. Its flesh fills stews, its seeds roasted into snacks, its blossoms turned into delicate fillings. You nibble a toasted squash seed, nutty and addictive, realizing you've just tasted what warriors might have munched on before battle. And yes, historians still argue whether squash cultivation began as food or storage, because its hollow shells made handy containers once scooped out. So was squash a vegetable or an ancient Tupperware? Probably both. Then there's the show-off of the group, chili peppers. No Aztec meal was complete without their fiery punch. You remember your tongue practically catching fire in the market earlier, and wince. Still, chilies weren't just for flavor. They were medicine, fumigants, and brace yourself, punishment tools. Parents sometimes made disobedient kids inhale chili smoke as discipline. Forget timeouts, here it was time in the smoke. Quirky, yes, and also a little terrifying. Tomatoes rounded out the lineup with juicy brightness. Picture a clay bowl of salsa, chopped tomatoes, chilies, maybe herbs, scooped up with tortillas. You're basically staring at the ancestor of your modern nachos topping. Spanish chroniclers were dazzled by tomatoes when they first encountered them, yet back in Europe, people later thought they were poisonous. Joke's on them, you've been feasting while they panicked over salad. And don't overlook amaranth, the quiet achiever. Its seeds, tiny but mighty, turned into doughy offerings for gods or popped into snacks. You take a handful, feeling the grains slip through your fingers like sand, and can't help but smile. It's the kind of health food trend Instagram would go wild for today. Back then, though, it was so sacred the Spanish banned it. Nothing says important crop like being outlawed. Each vegetable stitched itself into rituals too. Picture maize dolls dressed for festivals, amaranth dough shaped into idols, chilies burned to cleanse spaces. Eating wasn't just eating. It was participating in a cosmic loop. The gods fed humans maize. Humans fed gods maize back, often in ceremonial feasts. Food wasn't separate from spirituality. It was spirituality chewed and swallowed. And yet, daily meals weren't extravagant. You'd probably sit cross-legged in a courtyard with a simple tamale, a scoop of beans, and a dash of chili sauce. Maybe a squash stew if you were lucky. A noble might get fancier spreads, but the flavors, the building blocks, remain the same. Historians still argue whether this steady reliance on a narrow crop set was a strength or a weakness. On one hand, the trio of maize, beans, and squash covered nearly all nutritional bases. On the other, dependence on chinampa farming made the system vulnerable. Droughts, floods, or political upheaval could shake it all. Was the diet resilient or dangerously fragile? You chew on a roasted bean and realize it's one of those questions no one can answer with certainty. Yet, you recline in the canoe, imagining the Aztec table. Picture a child nibbling on squash blossoms, an elder sipping maize porridge, a warrior grabbing tamales before heading out. Food was shared, repeated, dependable. Unlike the market chaos you just left, meals grounded people, tied them to the chinampas that floated patiently beyond the city. And with that thought, you realize you're not just cataloging vegetables anymore. You're seeing them as the cast of characters in an empire's drama. Maize the godly star, beans the loyal sidekick, squash the multitasker, chilies the fiery trickster, tomatoes the misunderstood newcomer, amaranth the outlawed sage. A full ensemble, and every role mattered. Your canoe drifts further down the canal. Lanterns flicker on the water. The gardens you pass glow with green under the twilight, promising tomorrow's harvest. And your stomach, already full of tortillas and beans, mutters one last sarcastic note. Next time, maybe less chili. The canoe glides on, but now the canal narrows, its edges shadowed by leaning willows and rows of chinampas heavy with vines. You catch the earthy scent of fresh soil, mixed with the damp perfume of water lilies drifting lazily on the surface. The bustle of the market feels far away, replaced by something more grounded, almost intimate. Here, it's not just about what the Aztecs ate. It's about how they used every bit of it in clever, sometimes surprising ways. Take squash again. You think back to the roasted seeds crunching in your teeth, but then imagine the hollowed shells of the fruit, dried and repurposed into containers. It's recycling, 15th century edition. One family might store beans in a gourd shell, another might ladle water with it. The vines themselves sometimes twisted into makeshift ropes. You chuckle softly. Squash wasn't just dinner, it was basically Home Depot. Maize husks, too, had second lives. They weren't tossed aside after tamale making. Instead, they became wrapping materials, fuel for small fires, even stuffing for little dolls. Children would craft toys from them, their laughter echoing over the water while parents stirred pots nearby. And yes, historians still argue whether maize husk dolls were just playthings or held ritual meaning, standing in as symbolic offerings. You picture a kid hugging a lumpy maize husk doll, and think, probably both. Kids don't care if their toy doubles as sacred symbolism. They just want something to throw at their sibling. Chilies might have seemed destined only for food, but their pungent smoke told another story. Picture a family burning dried peppers not for flavor, but to fumigate a room against pests. Or, as you remember with a grimace, to discipline a mischievous child. And if you thought pepper spray was modern, think again. The Aztecs knew how to weaponize chilies. Warriors sometimes smeared chili mixtures on weapons, or villagers would toss chili smoke into enemy paths. Tactical spiciness. It's as painful as it sounds. Amaranth, meanwhile, wasn't just eaten. Its doughy paste, mixed sometimes with honey, formed effigies of gods. People would then ceremonially break and eat them, a spiritual act that blurred the line between worship and nutrition. You pause, chewing thoughtfully on the idea. Imagine biting into a divine cookie during a festival, nourishing body and soul in one crunchy bite. And let's not forget maguey plants. Technically not a vegetable, but part of the broader farming life. Its fibers were stripped to make ropes, clothing, even paper. Needles from the tips doubled as tools for sewing or ritual bloodletting. Your modern self winces. Sewing needles are fine, but jabbing your own skin for ritual duty? That's dedication. But perhaps the most curious use of vegetable matter was medicinal. A mother might grind chili with herbs to rub on a sore muscle. Squash seeds treated intestinal parasites. Bean infusions supposedly soothe fevers. Even tomato leaves, bitter and strong, sometimes featured in remedies. And yet, historians still argue whether these treatments worked medicinally or mostly carried symbolic meaning. Was it real pharmacology, or ritual placebo wrapped in spicy steam? Hard to say. As you drift, you hear the splash of a fish in the canal and realize these multi-uses made chinampa life efficient. Nothing wasted, everything interwoven. A single plant could feed, clothe, heal, and entertain. Imagine living in a world where your shopping list, toy chest, medicine cabinet, and toolkit all sprouted from the same garden. You smirk. Amazon Prime could never compete. The light shifts golden as the sun begins to tilt toward evening. Shadows stretch over the gardens, and you notice how villagers are already tending to chores. Weaving mats from maize stalks, carrying bundles of chili strings, stacking gourd shells. The air smells smoky from cooking fires, and laughter carries softly across the water. A boy tosses you a dried squash gourd from the bank. It bobs gently in the canal before you scoop it up. Smooth, hollow, surprisingly light. You shake it, and the faint rattle of leftover seeds inside makes it sound like a makeshift maraca. Maybe tomorrow it'll be a water ladle, or a child's toy, or broken into kindling. Tonight, though, it's just a reminder of how versatile life on the Chinampas really was. The canoe bumps softly against another floating plot, the gentle touch of reed mats brushing the hull. You run your hand through the water, cool and silty, and realize that the ingenuity of the Aztec farmers wasn't in chasing extravagance. It was in wringing every possible use out of the ordinary. Vegetables weren't just food, they were architecture, medicine, art, play, and even weapons. It's a strangely comforting thought that the everyday, if tended with care, can hold infinite possibilities. And as you lean back, squash gourd resting in your lap like a trophy, you catch yourself thinking that maybe tomorrow you'll actually try carving one into a bowl. Until then, the canal carries you on, whispering with reeds, promising more secrets ahead. The canoe drifts onward, and the sky deepens into a burnished orange, shadows pooling at the base of each chinampa. The quiet rhythm of paddling echoes softly in your ears, and you notice something fascinating. Not every floating garden looks the same. Some rise tall and straight, edged with carefully planted trees, while others slope low, fringed with grasses. You realize you're floating through a neighborhood of variety, each plot shaped by the hands and the priorities of its farmers. Think of it as Aztec suburbia. One plot might focus almost entirely on maize, neat rows glowing golden in the fading sun. Another might spread out with squash vines spilling everywhere, their blossoms bright against the dark soil. A third might show a checkerboard of beans and amaranth, interlaced like a quilt. You lean your head, amused. These were basically personalized garden usernames, except instead of an online avatar, your family identity was stitched into vegetables. Historians still argue whether certain families specialized in crops for trade, or whether everyone grew a bit of everything. The debate lingers. Were chinampas generalist survival plots, or proto-farm businesses? Either way, you imagine a friendly rivalry. Oh, that family's beans are sweeter. But those neighbors grow the chilies that'll make your face melt. Basically, a neighborhood cook-off every harvest season. You spot a farmer crouched low, tying maize stalks to keep them straight, while his child weeds in between. Across the water, another family is harvesting squash blossoms, plucking them with the careful precision of jewelers. A canoe passes, piled with leafy greens headed for market, the farmer balancing gracefully as he pulls forward. Each plot looks small, but you realize together they formed a patchwork so massive it fed hundreds of thousands. And the designs weren't just practical, they were ecological artistry. Trees planted along the edges, usually willows, anchored the soil and provided shade. Birds nested in their branches, swooping down for insects. Reeds filtered the water, keeping canals fresh. It was an integrated system where farm and environment blurred. You whisper to yourself, impressed. This is permaculture before permaculture even had a hashtag. But the ingenuity didn't stop at layout. Farmers also adapted their plots to shifting conditions. Heavy rains, they built higher embankments. Dry spells, they widened canals to pull in more water. Some chinampas even had raised ridges in zigzag patterns to slow erosion. Imagine tweaking your farm design every season like adjusting a smartphone setting. The land itself was flexible, a living invention, and you, drifting here centuries later, can almost sense the thousands of hands that shaped it. And quirks abounded. Some chinampas included small shrines tucked into corners, tiny altars with flowers or offerings. Others doubled as burial spots for beloved animals. Archaeologists have even found evidence of clay figurines buried in the soil, perhaps for fertility blessings. Historians still argue whether these were widespread practices or rare eccentricities. You picture a farmer hiding a little figurine under the beans like a secret charm, muttering, "Grow well or else." The variety extended beyond plants, too. Some families raised ducks or turkeys on their chinampas, their feathers fluttering as they waddled between rows. Others built small hut-like shelters right on the plot, storing tools or even sleeping overnight during busy times. The effect is almost whimsical, like a patchwork floating village where each backyard was half farm, half home. From your canoe, the scene looks almost painterly, a mosaic of greens and golds, browns and reds, each garden bordered by rippling water. You realize the word floating is a bit of a misnomer. These weren't rafts drifting loose, but anchored islands, permanent and stable. Yet the name sticks because they seem to hover on the surface, as though the land itself has learned to float. As the day edges closer to dusk, you notice the difference in light across each chinampa. One garden gleams bright with maize tassels shimmering in the sunset. Another looks shadowed and cool, hidden by trees. It's like each plot is a room in a house, each with its own atmosphere. You're drifting through a labyrinth not of walls, but of vegetables. The deeper you go, the more you feel the individuality. These weren't faceless farms churning out identical produce. Each chinampa reflected its maker, choices, traditions, quirks, rituals. You think of your own modern neighborhood and smile, where one family mows the lawn obsessively and another lets weeds grow. Here it was. One family pruning chilies with care, another letting squash vines sprawl wild. Different philosophies, same shared water. You lean back in the canoe, letting the gentle sway carry you, and the realization lingers. Aztec floating gardens weren't just engineering marvels. They were personal canvases, each plot painted with rows of vegetables, each telling the story of a family, a lineage, a way of life. And somewhere ahead, more of these stories wait, layered in soil, glimmering on water, whispering in the reeds as night slowly begins to fall. The last streaks of daylight fade, and the canals transform into liquid mirrors, catching the soft glow of torches from farmers still working into the evening. You float silently, listening. Crickets hum, frogs croak, and somewhere across the water, you hear the splash of an oar. Then a sharper sound, low, rhythmic thumping. You lean in, realizing it's the steady beat of grinding stones. Families are preparing their nightly meals. Imagine it. Women bent over metates, grinding maize into fine dough for tortillas, while men return from the fields carrying bundles of greens, beans, or chilies. The chinampas didn't just grow food, they choreographed daily life. Dinner was literally a few steps away, plucked fresh, seasoned with chilies dried under the same sun you just saw sinking. And the meals weren't plain. Far from it. Aztec cuisine had layers of spice, texture, and flavor. Think tamales stuffed with beans, squash blossoms sautéed with a little salt, or a stew simmered with chilies so fiery you'd need maize porridge to cool your tongue. Even insects found their way into the pot. Roasted grasshoppers or crunchy water boatman eggs, like a salty snack mix. You smirk, imagining a modern party bowl labeled Aztec trail mix may contain bugs. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs considered insects gourmet treats or everyday staples, but the fact remains. These chinampas supplied far more than corn and beans. They supported a complex, inventive food culture that kept an empire thriving. Picture a family huddled on the edge of their plot as night settles. A small clay pot bubbles gently on a fire. The scent of chilies rises, smoky and sharp, while masa dough sizzles on a comal griddle. Children dart back and forth, giggling, plucking fresh greens to throw in at the last minute. It's both survival and celebration. The garden is pantry, market, and medicine cabinet rolled into one. Because medicine, too, came straight from these plots. Herbs like epazote weren't just flavor, they soothed stomach aches. Amaranth seeds, ground fine, were pressed into nourishing pastes used for rituals and health. You realize every leaf here had multiple lives. Dinner, cure, or sacred offering. That duality makes you chuckle. Imagine seasoning your stew and healing your indigestion with the same plant. Efficiency goals unlocked. And speaking of rituals, food preparation blurred into ceremony. Some nights saw families shaping amaranth dough mixed with honey into figurines, later eaten in festivals. Historians still argue whether these treats symbolized gods, ancestors, or just indulgence disguised as piety. Either way, it meant that what sprouted in chinampas fed not only stomachs but spirits. The setting tonight feels timeless. Torches glimmer across the canal, their reflections rippling. You picture hundreds of families in sync, grinding, cooking, laughing, praying. Each chinampa sending aromas into the night air, maize sweetness, chili smoke, squash earthiness, all blending into a vast invisible feast. You breathe deep as though you can taste it, though all that reaches you is the faint dampness of reeds. And quirks emerge again. Archaeologists once found traces of cacao in cooking vessels near chinampa zones, suggesting farmers sometimes traded or borrowed ingredients from afar. Imagine a treat of maize porridge sweetened with cacao, steaming in the cool night. You sigh with envy. Your midnight snack is probably nowhere near that romantic. But it wasn't always calm feasts. The chinampas also carried pressure. Families had to keep producing, or risk hunger. Every tortilla, every bean stew depended on maintaining those waterlogged plots. A bad harvest meant smaller portions, fewer laughs around the fire. The stakes were high, and everyone, from children to elders, contributed. You picture a teenager rolling their eyes while being told to weed for the 100th time. Some things never change. The canals echo with one more sound before you drift further: laughter. It drifts lightly through the darkness, carrying across water like music. You realize daily meals weren't just about fuel. They were about community, a way of binding family and neighbors together. The chinampas provided not just crops, but rhythm. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, anchors to each day, reminders of continuity in a world where seasons shifted and rulers rose and fell. You close your eyes for a moment, letting that rhythm wash over you. Grind, cook, eat, laugh, sleep. Repeat. The chinampas turned soil into sustenance, sustenance into family, and family into resilience. Tonight, you're just a quiet observer in the canoe, but the scent of imagined chilies clings to your thoughts as the torchlight fades into night. The air tonight feels thicker, weighted with the sweet smell of wet reeds and the sharp tang of lake mud. Your canoe drifts quietly through narrow channels, the water lapping softly at its sides, when a flicker of light catches your eye. Ahead, not torches this time, but the shimmering glow of distant fires across the water, bonfires for festivals, where food and ritual fused together. The chinampas weren't just fields, they were stages for celebration. Imagine it, harvest season, families piling squash, maize, and beans onto reed mats, carrying them toward the heart of Tenochtitlan. The capital buzzes with life, music echoing from drums, dancers stomping rhythms into stone plazas, and vendors setting up stalls with chinampa-grown goods. The city breathes with energy, fueled by the gardens you've been drifting past. Historians still argue whether the massive feasts thrown during festivals were communal free-for-alls or tightly controlled by nobles. Either way, they were spectacles. Steaming tamales passed around, chocolate drinks whisked into foamy froth, chili sauces thick and fiery, everything sourced from the chinampa system. It was a reminder that this watery patchwork wasn't just about survival. It was about spectacle, culture, and identity. Picture the feast of Tlaxcalquimco, when garlands of flowers, also grown here, decorated temples. Priests sprinkled maize kernels onto fires as offerings, while musicians played bone flutes and shell trumpets. Meanwhile, ordinary families savored the same maize in tamales or tortillas, laughing together in torchlight. The duality makes you grin. On one side, a lofty ritual for the gods. On the other, someone stuffing their face with too many tamales and regretting it later. Some traditions are eternal. The chinampas also provided offerings for more serious occasions. Think of cacao beans traded from afar, maize ground into sacred dough, or even amaranth mixed with honey to craft figurines symbolizing deities. These weren't just snacks, they were edible prayers. You glance down at the black surface of the canal and wonder how many offerings sank here, cast into water as gifts to unseen forces. And quirks always surface. Did you know certain foods were linked to social status? Turkeys and chocolate drinks were mostly reserved for elites, while common folk leaned on maize, beans, and chilies. Yet festivals blurred those lines. For a few days, everyone might share in foods otherwise too rare or costly. It was a reminder that the chinampas could lift spirits beyond daily rations, feeding unity as much as stomachs. But not every festival was cheerful. Some ceremonies honored gods of rain or fertility with offerings that were, let's just say, more intense. Historians still argue how widespread these more somber rites were, but the fact remains. The chinampas supplied the physical goods, flowers, maize, herbs, that made these rituals possible. You realize these gardens held power not just in nutrition, but in belief. Now imagine the night sky above you alive with sparks, fireworks of burning resin tossed into fires. You hear drums reverberating like thunder through the city, carried on the wind across the water. Farmers on the chinampas pause their work, watching from their plots, knowing that the vegetables they grew fed the stomachs of dancers, priests, nobles, and children all at once. And in quieter moments, smaller festivals rippled through local communities. Families gathered on the edges of chinampas, lighting their own fires, offering their own prayers. Someone strummed a shell instrument, children sang songs they half remembered, and elders told tales of past harvests. You smile, imagining a child sneaking roasted squash seeds while pretending to be reverent. Mischief never needed a time period. What fascinates you most is how every celebration traced back to the soil and water you've been gliding past. Without chinampas, no feasts, no rituals, no cultural glue binding the empire together. It's like realizing that your grandma's casserole dish is secretly the backbone of an entire civilization. You chuckle softly, startling a frog that plops into the water with a splash. As you drift further, the sounds fade into the distance, drums becoming heartbeats, laughter becoming whispers, fires becoming faint embers on the horizon. The chinampas settle back into silence, their daytime energy folded away like mats after a festival. But the sense lingers. These gardens weren't quiet backdrops, they pulsed with life, joy, and meaning. Each harvest carried not just calories, but the promise of memory, ritual, and togetherness. You lean back in your canoe, staring at the faint glow of smoke rising into the starry night, and you realize, food wasn't just food here. It was performance, prayer, and power. And all of it began in these floating gardens under the moonlight. The night carries you deeper, and with each push of the paddle, you drift past something that makes your mind wander toward the idea of wealth. Not just in the golden cents that conquistadors drooled over, but in the edible currency these gardens produced. You lean close to the edge of your canoe, watching maize stalks sway like soldiers standing guard, and you realize this was the real fortune of the Aztecs. Here, maize wasn't just a plant. It was the spine of the economy, the daily bread, the tortilla wrapped around almost every meal. You picture sacks of maize kernels stacked high in storehouses, their earthy smell mingling with smoke from nearby kitchens. Each kernel, small and unassuming, carried the weight of taxes, trade, and tribute. Without maize, the empire collapses. And yes, you'd probably collapse too. Try lasting a week on nothing but plain water and a few lake fish. Spoiler, you won't. Historians still argue whether the chinampas were more valuable than the imperial tribute system drawn from conquered lands. But you can imagine the smug grin of a chinampa farmer who knew he could outlast famines while others went hungry. Food stability. That was the true treasure. It wasn't just maize, though. Beans, squash, amaranth, chilies, all combined to create what modern nutritionists now nod approvingly at, the Three Sisters agricultural combo. Together they provided proteins, vitamins, and enough variety to keep meals interesting. You picture a family sitting on woven mats, steaming tamales unwrapped from green leaves, beans simmering in clay pots, and chilies crushed into sauces so fiery they'd make a grown man cry and pretend it was just allergies. But the economic side is fascinating too. Imagine a bustling Tenochtitlan market, where every stall is piled with chinampa produce. Women haggle, traders shout, kids dart between crowds with sticky fingers clutching roasted maize. And in the background, officials take careful count of tribute. Maize for the emperor's granaries, beans for soldiers, flowers for rituals. You suddenly realize the chinampas didn't just feed bellies. They kept armies marching and palaces thriving. Quirks sneak in here as always. Did you know cacao beans? Yes, those little things you'd kill for in chocolate form were used as currency. A rabbit might cost you 30 cacao beans. A canoe ride? Maybe 20. And if you were clever, you could fake the system by hollowing out beans and stuffing them with dirt. Historians still argue how widespread this chocolate-based fraud was, but it proves one thing. People will always find a way to scam with whatever's valuable. Forget Bitcoin, Aztec crypto was chocolate. You tilt your head, imagining the absurdity of dropping your wallet and losing a month's rent in cacao beans, watching squirrels make off with your cash. Not the most secure banking system, but hey, at least it was tasty. Wealth also showed itself in feasts. Nobles dined on turkey, rabbit, and even tiny freshwater shrimp caught in the lakes. Commoners might never taste those luxuries, but maize tortillas never failed to show up, rolled around beans or dipped in chili sauce. The chinampas guaranteed that while palaces sparkled with variety, no stomach stayed empty for long. That kind of baseline stability, that's worth more than gold. And there's something poetic about how wealth circulated here. Food wasn't locked in vaults. It was grown in plain sight, tended daily by farmers in woven capes, watered by canals where children swam. You look around now at the moonlit chinampas, neat as chessboards, and you can almost see each plant shimmering with value. Every squash, every bean pod, every ear of maize is a coin in nature's economy. The debates among scholars, oh, they love these, circle around whether the chinampas were so productive they could have supported millions, even beyond the empire's actual population. Some say the numbers are exaggerated. Others argue they might have fed not just Tenochtitlan, but entire regions. You smirk, thinking of how every historian seems to secretly wish they could run a chinampa like a test farm, measuring yields instead of reading dusty codices. But the essence is clear to you as you drift under stars. Wealth wasn't shiny metal here. It was edible, renewable, fragrant, and steaming hot on clay plates. The empire's treasure wasn't buried. It grew daily in mud and water where farmers bent low to tend it. You dip your fingers into the canal and feel the cool silk of the water, imagining it as a current carrying wealth straight into the heart of the city. And the best part, you could eat this fortune, every bite a reminder that survival and celebration were tied to the soil beneath your canoe. No vault could compete with a tortilla fresh off the griddle, rolled around beans grown on these floating gardens. Your canoe glides through a stretch where the chinampas seem to grow more fragrant, and you realize it's not maize or beans wafting into your nose, it's flowers. Bright blooms rise like lanterns from the dark soil, glowing even in moonlight. You lean closer and catch sight of marigolds, dahlias, and bright red poinsettias, each one a living jewel. This wasn't just food production. This was beauty cultivated with the same precision as survival. You picture the bustling city of Tenochtitlan waking to colors as much as to smells. Imagine noble courtyards scattered with flower petals, temples draped with garlands, and feasts where the tables themselves seemed alive with blossoms. Marigolds, in particular, carried heavy spiritual symbolism, their golden petals thought to guide souls in rituals. You can almost feel their velvety softness under your fingertips, though you resist reaching out and stealing one from this sacred scene. And oh, the dahlias, Mexico's national flower today. Back then, their hollow stems weren't just admired, but sometimes used for carrying water, like nature's own straws. You smirk, imagining an Aztec kid blowing bubbles through one while their mother scolds them for wasting water. Historians still argue whether dahlias were cultivated primarily for beauty or for these quirky practical uses, but you sense the truth is probably both. Poinsettias, with their fiery red bracts, weren't just Christmas decor long before Christmas existed. They had ritual significance, the crimson leaves often associated with sacrifice and life force. You let that sink in, a flower that doubled as spiritual shorthand for blood. It makes you glance uneasily at the dark water, remembering how life and death constantly entwined in this empire. But it wasn't all solemnity. Flowers were woven into daily life in ways that feel startlingly modern. Markets brimmed with fragrant bundles, women tucking them into their hair or braiding them into necklaces. Lovers might exchange blossoms the way you'd swap texts today. Simple, wordless signals carrying entire conversations. One bouquet could mean desire, another respect, another gratitude. You chuckle, picturing an awkward young farmer trying to confess affection with a marigold, fumbling the bouquet so half of it splashes into the canal. Smooth. Chinampas dedicated to flowers also played economic roles. They supplied markets, temples, and households with steady blooms, ensuring that festivals never lacked decoration. Wealthy families could practically drown themselves in petals during celebrations, while ordinary folk still had access to color that brightened daily life. That's one of those underappreciated luxuries. Imagine living in a city where every street smelled faintly of blossoms because the supply never stopped. One quirky tidbit: Aztecs used ground-up flowers and herbs to make dyes and perfumes, with marigolds providing pigments for textiles. The same petals that guided souls in rituals might also tint someone's cloak. Talk about multitasking flora. And yes, they even made floral crowns, so you weren't entirely wrong if you just pictured a bustling Tenochtitlan hipster scene. Historians still argue whether flower chinampas matched the productivity of food gardens, but it's clear they mattered deeply to Aztec identity. Flowers weren't optional extras. They were embedded into religion, ceremony, and daily aesthetics. Without them, Tenochtitlan would have felt half alive, fed, yes, but flavorless to the senses. You float along now, and the air thickens with perfume, the kind that seeps into your clothes and clings to your skin. It's soothing, a lullaby in scent form. You can almost feel your eyes getting heavier, lulled by the idea that beauty itself was cultivated alongside necessity. In the Aztec worldview, survival wasn't enough. You also needed splendor. You needed petals, not just tortillas. And it dawns on you that maybe that's why these gardens feel so alive in your imagination, because they weren't purely functional. They were art stitched into agriculture, a city choosing to live among flowers as much as among maize stalks. You glance down at your canoe again and picture its prow piled high with blossoms. drifting into the market to be sold for songs, ceremonies, and subtle declarations of love. Your journey tonight is scented, colorful, and a reminder that wealth isn't just edible. Sometimes it blooms, fragile and fragrant, lasting only a few days but remembered for centuries. Your paddle strokes carry you deeper into the chinampa maze, and this time you notice shapes breaking the otherwise smooth silhouettes of maize and flowers. Fat pumpkins curl their orange bellies on the soil, beans twine like green ropes around maize stalks, and chili peppers dangle like tiny red flames from wiry plants. You've stumbled upon the classic Aztec three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, plus their fiery cousin chili. This patch is less about aesthetics, more about calories and spice. The intercropping is genius. Maize provides a tall stalk for beans to climb. Beans fix nitrogen in the soil, so everything stays fertile, and squash sprawls low to smother weeds while keeping the soil moist. It's like watching a perfectly rehearsed band, every instrument in sync. You marvel at how this wasn't trial and error for the Aztecs. It was centuries of agricultural wisdom condensed into one planting strategy. Imagine your dinner menu growing in harmony right under your nose. And there's the chili. You feel your tongue tingle just thinking about it. Aztecs adored their peppers, mild ones, smoky ones, and brutally spicy ones that could make you sweat through your cloak. Chilies flavored nearly everything, from maize tamales to bean stews. But they weren't just food enhancers. Inhaling chili smoke was a punishment for disobedient children. You wince, picturing a kid coughing miserably in a hut filled with pepper fumes, while mom calmly explains, "Next time, clean your room." Historians still argue whether this practice was more symbolic than widespread, but either way, it's the most spicy discipline imaginable. Pumpkins and squashes, meanwhile, weren't just carved up for stews. Their seeds, pepitas, were prized, roasted and ground into sauces or eaten as crunchy snacks. You can almost taste that nutty flavor as you drift past, realizing that what you snack on in modern trail mix has a history stretching back to these floating gardens. Squash blossoms were eaten too, bright yellow petals stuffed into dishes. Even the shells, once dried, could double as bowls or containers. These plants didn't waste a thing. Beans came in many forms, black, white, red, and they supplied much of the protein in the Aztec diet. Paired with maize, they formed a nutritional powerhouse, giving bodies the complete amino acids needed to survive. No wonder people here thrived despite lacking cattle, sheep, or pigs. The land itself was their butcher, baker, and spice rack. And don't forget amaranth, technically another super grain, often grown alongside these staples. Its tiny seeds packed huge energy, and it could be popped like popcorn or ground into flour. But here's a quirky tidbit. Amaranth was also molded into ritual figurines, sometimes shaped like gods, then eaten during ceremonies. Imagine making your chocolate Easter bunny, but it's a deity, and you're expected to bite the head off reverently. Historians still argue whether the Spanish later banned amaranth because of these associations with ritual cannibalism symbolism, or because they just didn't like competition for wheat. The air grows heavier with earthy scents as you pass. You can almost smell the cooked version, beans simmered until soft, maize ground into masa, squash roasted until sweet, chilies roasted until smoky. It's a kitchen before kitchens, right here on these islands. You picture a farmer tugging a pumpkin into a canoe, beans slung over his shoulder, while kids snatch peppers to dare each other into taking a bite. Some things never change. Kids still weaponize chili dares at recess. These vegetables weren't just sustenance, they were culture. Festivals celebrated maize, songs mentioned beans, and chili metaphors crept into poetry and jokes. Imagine an Aztec pickup line. "Girl, you're as hot as a smoked chili." Effective? Maybe. Hilarious? Definitely. As your canoe glides on, you realize how symbiotic this whole system is. The plants rely on each other, just as the Aztecs relied on them. Food wasn't an afterthought here. It was the foundation of survival, ritual, and identity. And with each stroke of your paddle, you understand more clearly how genius these chinampas were. Not just floating fields, but floating pantries, kitchens, and pharmacies all in one. The breeze carries the faint sting of chili to your nose, and your eyes water in sympathy. You laugh softly, imagining yourself sneezing mid-canoe ride. You're slipping, splashing into the water while locals shake their heads. Welcome to Aztec agriculture. Beautiful, delicious, and occasionally painful. The waterway narrows again, the hush of reeds closing around you, and suddenly you notice the chinampa ahead brimming with plants that feel different from the main food staples. These aren't the heavy hitters like maize or squash. These are the delicate ones, the seasoning agents, the quiet companions of the big crops. Herbs and flavorings. You realize quickly that these plots weren't just about survival. They were about taste, medicine, and a sense of balance in daily meals. The first fragrance that hits you is episode, its jagged green leaves waving lazily in the breeze. It's pungent, sharp, almost medicinal, and Aztec cooks swore by it. Add episode to a pot of beans, and suddenly the earthy heaviness lifts. More importantly, it was believed to prevent, shall we say, digestive side effects. Yes, the Aztecs had the same bean problem you do. Some things are timeless. You chuckle, picturing a mother in Tenochtitlan stirring beans with a resigned sigh muttering, "No episode, and everyone's sleeping outside tonight." Historians still argue whether its medicinal benefits were exaggerated or scientifically sound, but the cultural belief in it was unshakable. Close by grows cilantro, bright, citrusy, and fresh. You lean in, rub a leaf, and the scent fills your nose. For you, it's salsa and tacos. For them, it was an essential garnish, brightening otherwise dense flavors. And its seeds, coriander, had a second life in remedies and tonics. Even here in the chinampas, it was clear that flavor doubled as pharmacy. A splash of yellow catches your eye. Marigolds. Yes, the very same flowers you might see lining altars today during Dia de los Muertos. Back then, they weren't just pretty. They had medicinal value, brewed into teas to soothe stomach aches. They also repelled pests, acting as natural bug control. Imagine farming without sprays, just trusting cheerful golden petals to do the heavy lifting. It's beautiful and practical, a recurring Aztec theme. Nearby, a patch of vanilla orchids clings to tree trunks, their tendrils curling upward. Vanilla was one of Mesoamerica's most luxurious gifts to the world, used in drinks alongside cacao. The Aztecs didn't bake cookies, but they absolutely knew the power of a good vanilla cacao froth. Here's the quirky tidbit. Cultivating vanilla required careful hand pollination by human hands, since the natural pollinator bees existed far to the south. Imagine the patience, climbing around flower by flower, just to sweeten a single drink. If you complain about stirring sugar into coffee, you'd never make it here. Historians still argue whether this pollination was a widespread practice before the Spanish, or if large-scale vanilla farming came later. But either way, the orchid thrived in these plots. And then there's chocolate mint, not the candy flavor, but a local aromatic herb with a cooling zing. Farmers used it in stews and teas, sometimes as a treatment for fevers. You bend down and imagine inhaling a cup of minty warmth on a chilly highland evening, the smoke of chinampa fires curling in the background. One more star stands out. Achiote shrubs, their seed pods bursting with red pigment. Ground into powder, achiote flavored and colored food, giving tamales that earthy golden red hue. But beyond the kitchen, achiote was body paint and ritual dye. Warriors slathered it on their skin, priests painted with it, and cooks sprinkled it on tortillas. Food, fashion, and ritual all borrowed from this same little shrub. You picture a priest and a cook arguing over the last handful of achiote seeds. One wants to bless the temple, the other wants to season the stew. Priorities. The mix of herbs makes this garden smell like a giant kitchen. Each plant plays multiple roles: culinary, medicinal, spiritual. Even the simple act of chewing a leaf could ease pain, spice a dish, or ward off spirits. This layering of purposes kept chinampas endlessly productive, far beyond mere survival. They became cultural pharmacies, perfumeries, and spice racks, all bobbing gently on water. And of course, let's not forget chili varieties beyond the basics. The chinampas grew smoky chipotles, yellow chilihuacles, and tiny pecans. Each one brought a different personality to food: heat, tang, or smoke. The Aztecs classified them the way modern coffee drinkers classify roasts. You can almost imagine an Aztec hipster saying, "Oh, I only use chilhuacal amarillo. It's more authentic." The canoe glides past, and the scents wrap around you. Earthy epazote, bright cilantro, sharp marigold, sweet vanilla, bitter achiote, cooling mint, fiery chili. It feels like drifting through the world's earliest spice aisle, except it's alive and green and pulsing with culture. The deeper you breathe it in, the more you realize the Aztec genius wasn't just about farming calories. It was about farming flavor, emotion, and identity. Eating wasn't a dull necessity, it was an art. And here, in these floating gardens, every herb whispered stories of meals, cures, and rituals. You can't help but feel a little envious. Your spice rack at home, crammed with jars, looks dead compared to this living perfume. The last image before you drift past is a farmer carefully clipping herbs into a woven basket, the leaves still wet with morning dew. He pauses, lifts a sprig to his nose, inhales, and smiles. Food, medicine, memory, it all starts here, in the green breath of the chinampas. The canoe drifts onward, and for a moment, you find yourself staring at a chinampa that doesn't shimmer with maize, beans, or herbs, but with something stranger. Here, low wooden frames rise above the water's edge, draped with clusters of hanging leaves, roots, and curious seed pods. These are the crops less talked about, the oddballs of Aztec farming, fibers, dyes, and experimentals that never made it into the tourist brochures. You notice a patch of amaranth, its crimson seed heads swaying like torches. We've mentioned it before in passing, but here it takes center stage. Amaranth wasn't just food, it was ritual. Its seeds, ground with honey, sometimes shaped into figurines of gods, were eaten in ceremonies. You bite into one in your imagination and taste a nutty crunch, sweetened with a drizzle of syrup. But this sweetness carried weight. The Spanish later banned these practices, calling them pagan. Historians still argue whether this ban was strictly enforced or more symbolic, but the fact remains. One of the Aztecs' most nutritious and versatile grains was tangled up with religion. Beside it, you see cotton plants, their fluffy bowls bursting like clouds. Cotton wasn't native to the chinampas, but small test plots existed to supplement fields elsewhere. Imagine the patience. Each ball picked, spun, dyed with indigo or cochineal, and woven into garments that marked rank. Clothing here wasn't fashion, it was politics. Who wore what colors told the city who they were. Cotton wasn't just fiber, it was status. A little farther along, some chia plants stand tall, their spiky blossoms nodding in the sun. Yes, chia, the same seeds now sprinkled on your smoothies. The Aztecs drank them as energy tonics, suspended in water, sometimes flavored with lime or honey. Legend claimed that a handful of chia could fuel a runner for an entire day. You picture yourself trying that, then 2 hours later begging for a burrito. But still, the fact that such tiny seeds carried such prestige tells you everything about Aztec efficiency. They prized what worked. Near the edge of the chinampa, you spot clusters of spirulina algae, harvested in mats from the shallow water. The locals called it Tenochtitlan, drying it into cakes that could be stored for months. It wasn't glamorous, but it packed nutrition like a futuristic supplement bar. Imagine a bustling market where maize tamales sat next to slabs of dried green algae cakes. It's not appetizing, but it worked. And again, historians still argue whether spirulina was a staple or just a backup. But you can't deny the brilliance of transforming pond scum into protein. A darker corner shows something eerie. Peyote and hallucinogenic mushrooms tended carefully in hidden patches. These weren't daily foods but sacred crops, used in ceremonies to bend perception, to bridge human and divine. Shamans guided their use, and participants claimed visions, healing, and connection to gods. You shiver slightly at the thought. This is not the kind of garden tour where you walk away with a salad. You walk away with your worldview scrambled like eggs. And speaking of dyes, nearby grows the indigo plant, its green leaves hiding the blue locked inside. Indigo, along with cochineal from cacti, created colors that reached palaces and priestly robes. Farmers coaxed out hues that traveled the world, long before global trade networks had names. A blue cloak wasn't just pretty, it was authority wrapped in pigment. The strangest sight, though, is an experimental bed of sunflowers, their heads craning toward the sky. Some evidence suggests they were cultivated for oil, medicine, and ritual symbolism. Picture an Aztec healer pressing seeds for ointment, or priests offering the radiant flowers as symbols of solar power. It's not the typical maize and bean staple, but it's another thread in this enormous woven fabric of survival and spirituality. As your canoe rocks gently, the thought settles in. These floating gardens weren't static. They were experimental labs, testing what the land could give, what the water could nurture, and what people could make of it. They fed, clothed, dyed, healed, and even intoxicated the Aztec world. Every inch of chinampa space was maximized, each plant chosen for multiple reasons: calories, ritual, trade, beauty. Nothing was wasted. Now the sun begins to sink, painting the water copper. Farmers pull their canoes ashore, arms heavy with baskets of produce: green herbs, golden squash, crimson amaranth, fluffy cotton. Smoke rises from distant hearths as the day winds down. You feel yourself slowing too, eyelids heavy, the rhythm of water lapping against wood like a lullaby. And so the floating gardens fade from your view, not as relics, but as living testaments to ingenuity. Their echoes remain in the food you eat today: corn tortillas, chocolate spiced with vanilla, chia sprinkled in water, chilies burning on your tongue. You carry them with you even if you never stepped foot on a chinampa. And now the story softens. Your breath slows with the rocking of the canoe. The last sounds are faint voices across the water, farmers calling good night, a bird fluttering into reeds, the hush of dusk wrapping the gardens. The chinampas shrink in the dark, their edges blurring with water, until they feel like a dream. You don't need to row anymore. Just drift. Drift with the gardens, drift with the stars, drift into sleep. Everything is cared for here. The plants, the people, the water, and now you. The night will hold you. The story begins to dissolve into stillness, and you're left with only the gentle afterimage of those floating gardens, rocking softly in your mind. The air is cooler now, carrying the hush of reeds and the faint perfume of crushed herbs. In the distance, firelight flickers low, not to call attention, but to ease the darkness into something warm and safe. Your body, too, begins to feel like one of those gardens, buoyant, floating, supported on every side. The muscles in your face loosen, your shoulders sink, your breath spreads wider, slower. You no longer need to imagine rowing, or trudging, or even looking. The gardens continue without you, tended carefully, night after night, season after season. You are allowed to let go. Even the sounds soften, the voices of farmers, the trickle of water, the rustle of leaves, all fading into a single, hushed lull. Every detail that once felt vivid, the taste of chocolate, the bite of chili, the shimmer of marigold, blends into one long, low note, drawn out like a hum meant only to soothe. Your thoughts, too, begin to slow, becoming lighter, looser, until they lift and drift like seeds on water. There's no rush, no chores, no expectations. Just the steady float, steady calm, steady night. And in this stillness, you find yourself safe. You find yourself held. You find yourself already halfway to sleep. Good night. Sweet dreams.